President Dwight Eisenhower. This program is about 2.5 hours.
Everybody likes Dwight for president. Hang out the banners, beat the drum. We'll take Dwight to Washington.
D. Dwight Eisenhower's odyssey to the White House began near the turn of the century. Although he was born in Denison, Texas in 1890, he and his 5 brothers were raised in the sober farming community of Abilene, Kansas. There, they were taught to appreciate hard work and to fear God. With his broad grin and affable personality, Eisenhower, or Ike as he was known, most closely resembled his mother, Ida. The Abilene High School class of 1909 voted Eisenhower best historian and mathematician. But his dream was to become a soldier. He abandoned his job at the local creamery in 1911 to enter West Point Academy, where he officially became known as Dwight D. Eisenhower. Ike met the vacationing Mamie Dowd at his first Army post in Fort Sam Houston, Texas. At an afternoon party, they sipped grape juice together. Immediately smitten, he proclaimed her saucy, and she told a friend that he was, quote, a bruiser. They were married on July 1st, 1916. While Eisenhower was on assignment in Georgia in 1917, Mamie gave birth to their first son, Dwight Dowd Eisenhower, or Icky. Goodbye for now, he wrote in a letter to Mamie following Icky's birth. I love you, love you, love you awful much. Icky died of scarlet fever 3 years later. Eisenhower called his death the greatest disappointment and disaster of my life. Their second son, John Sheldon David Eisenhower, was born in 1923 and helped, Eisenhower said, to fill the gap we felt so poignantly and so deeply every day of our lives since the death of our first son. Eisenhower moved upward through the Army ranks over the next 2 decades. World War II catapulted Eisenhower into a national war hero. As Supreme Allied Commander, he was a deft leader with a fiery temper. After one of his more memorable explosions, a colleague wondered aloud how it would be possible to, quote, compute the amount of adrenaline expended in those 30 seconds. When he retired from the Army in 1948, he was, in the words of a sergeant, quote, the whole Milky Way, or a 5-star general. The same year, he became the president of Columbia University. His duties consisted largely of attending fundraising dinners and delivering speeches. At one particularly long event, Eisenhower delighted the audience when he approached the podium at the end of the night and said, "Tonight, I am the punctuation. I am the period." And then he sat down. In 1951, President Truman appointed him Supreme Commander of the newly formed NATO. During this time, he continued to be recruited by both Democrats and Republicans who wanted him to run for president. He protested once, saying, quote, I cannot conceive of any circumstance that could drag out of me permission to consider me for any political post from dog catcher to Grand High Supreme King of the Universe. He was elected as a Republican to the first of his 2 terms in 1952, with Richard Milhous Nixon as his vice president. During his presidency, Eisenhower was faced with the conclusion of the Korean War, McCarthyism, and burgeoning civil rights issues. To relax, he played golf and had a putting green installed near the Rose Garden. Landscape painting was his passion. He denied any artistic ability, conceding only that he, quote, got a bang out of working with colors. In 1955, he suffered a mild heart attack, most likely caused by his former 4-pack-a-day cigarette habit and the stress from his military career. Following John Kennedy's inauguration in 1961, Eisenhower and his wife retired to Gettysburg, Pennsylvania. In the late 60s, he suffered a number of heart attacks that finally led to congestive heart failure. On his deathbed, he proclaimed his love for his family and his country. His last words were, quote, I want to go. God take me. He died on March 28, 1969.
I take up this task, therefore, in a spirit of deep obligation, mindful of its burdens and of its decisive importance. I accept your summons. I will lead this crusade.
President, I for president, I for president. You like Ike, I like Ike. Everybody likes Ike for president. Hang out the banner, beat the drum. We'll take Ike to Washington. You like Ike, I like Ike. Everybody likes Ike for president. Hang out the banner, beat the drum. We'll take Ike to
That's music from the 1952 presidential campaign of Dwight David Eisenhower. This statue of Ike stands in the middle of a campus-like setting. It makes up the Eisenhower Center in Abilene, Kansas. Just below the statue, it's inscribed Champion of Peace. Several of the buildings at this center represent the bookends of Eisenhower's life. In the middle of it all, you see a house where he grew up and he lived until leaving for West Point in 1911. And at the opposite end is a place of meditation, where he's buried next to Mamie, his wife of 52 years, and his first son, Icky, who died of scarlet fever at age 3. Also here is a library. It houses the Eisenhower papers. And across the way is the museum, which is the site of our live program today, number 33 in our American President series for our 34th president. Jeffrey Perret is here with us today. He has a brand new biography out of Eisenhower. It's just being released this month. Mr. Perret, as you were doing your research on Eisenhower, what was the part of his character that was hardest to get your hands around?
Eisenhower found it impossible to talk about his emotions. And so it's difficult sometimes to get at Eisenhower's inner life. But he was a deeply emotional man, and what he felt was there. He just couldn't talk about it.
Center Director Dan Holt is with us this morning also. Good morning to you.
Morning.
When people come here, what's the most often asked question that they ask about the character or the personality of Mr. Eisenhower?
Why people liked him, I think, basically. And of course, with that smile he had and the affable way he had with getting along with people, that's the easiest answer. He liked people, basically. But
as always, our phone lines are open for this presidential series. We'd invite you to join us. We have our phone lines divided up a little bit differently today. Here's how we'd like to do it. For the East and Central Time Zone, you call this number, 202-624-1111. If you live in the Mountain or Pacific Time Zone, it's 202-624-1115. And then we've also set aside a phone line specifically for veterans of World War II. And that phone number is 202-737-6734. And particularly, again, that is for veterans of World War II, since that was so much of what was a part of the life of Mr. Eisenhower. Dan Holt, where are we in Kansas?
almost right in the center of the state. We're about a 2.5-hour drive from Kansas City, barring construction on the highways. About an hour and 20 minutes from Topeka, hour and a half from Wichita, 6 hours from Dallas, about 6.5 hours from Denver. So we're right in the heartland, as Ike called it.
And how did the Eisenhower family, Mr. Perret, get to this part of Kansas?
Well, the Eisenhowers originally came from Pennsylvania. They were Pennsylvania Dutch. His mother came from Virginia, and they were very religious people. The Eisenhowers had pastors in the family, and they wanted to develop a new community somewhere, and they found that Kansas had plenty of free homestead land. They could come out here and create a community more or less the kind that people like that dreamt of. It was something new. In effect, it is free of the sin of the old. They start with a blank slate. And Kansas had a reputation already for being a righteous kind of place. This was the state of Carrie Nation, who was really the first big anti-drink campaigner. She was a prohibitionist pioneer. So Kansas was really their kind of place. Lots of cheap land, an almost clean slate, and a very high moral tone, because Kansas had been settled in the first place by people from Massachusetts, abolitionists, who wanted to make sure that Kansas did not become a slave state. So moral issues were always very important in this part of the country.
Mr. Holt, we have some video of what Abilene looks like today. Take a look at it and tell us a little bit about this town and where the Eisenhower Center is based. And how has it changed since Eisenhower lived here?
Well, the buildings have changed somewhat, but if you drive around town, you look at the old photographs, they've just been updated. Of course, as you may hear today on the program, the train's right outside our back door. It's a chicken or the egg in Abilene, whether the cattle or the train really made the town. But as a combination, when Joseph McCoy offered to bring the railroad out to Abilene to connect with the Chisholm Trail for the cattle drives, and of course that gets us back to the Abilene's Wild West days of Wild Bill Hickok and those stories. But it's a very well-kept town. It's very fascinating, especially the large houses that's in the community, and most of the buildings in the current downtown area date from that early past.
How many people live here today?
About 6,800.
And how many people lived here when Eisenhower grew up here?
It's about 4,500, depending on how you move the city limits around. Today, of course, those are different counts. I checked on this the other day, and it's difficult to know exactly how many were here the first few years of Abilene.
Mr. Prey, you only have to walk, as Mr. Holt said, maybe 100 steps out of here to see the railroad, which is very close to where Eisenhower's home was. What was the importance of him growing up that close to the railroad tracks?
The railroads were a link to the outside world. And they're a constant reminder that there is more to America than Kansas.
Is that when he found that out?
I think anybody who lives next to the railroad tracks or grows up next to the railroad tracks develops a curiosity to see what is further down the tracks. Also, because to a small boy, a railroad is excitement.
Take some calls for you. First call, St. Petersburg, Florida. Good morning.
Yes, good morning. Something that I've always wondered about, why we didn't as a country heed President Eisenhower's warning about the military-industrial complex. I mean, here was a man that practically saved the world as the commander of our forces against the Axis powers, and he warns us about this military-industrial complex, and then within a decade we are in Vietnam, and we didn't heed his warning, and the military-industrial complex practically destroyed this country.
Thanks, St. Petersburg. Military-industrial complex. Mr. Prey.
Eisenhower really wanted to make it the military-industrial congressional complex, but he didn't know quite how to work the Congress into it, because Congress was part of the problem. The big defense industries had very strong friends in Congress, and of course it's got powerful friends in the Pentagon, and the three of them were pushing their own programs, making the country buy more weapons than he believed it actually needed for its own defense. And why that wasn't heeded, I could give you a short answer to it, which I don't think will be really accurate. Namely, is that it took some time for people to understand exactly what he was driving at. And there is a much longer answer that goes right to the heart of the relationship between the people and their government.
We have an audio clip where you will be able to hear the 1961 speech where he refers to this. It was his farewell speech, where he referred to that actual phrase.
Oh, yes.
And you write in your book that he actually scratched out the word congressional.
That's correct.
Let's hear that, and we'll come back.
In the councils of government, we must guard against the acquisition of unwarranted influence, whether sought or unsought, by the military-industrial complex. The potential for the disastrous rise of misplaced power exists and will persist. We must never let the weight of this combination endanger our liberties or democratic processes. We should take nothing for granted. Only an alert and knowledgeable citizenry can compel the proper meshing of the huge industrial and military machinery of defense with our peaceful methods and goals, so that security and liberty may prosper together.
Lakeside, California, you're next.
Yeah, hello?
Go ahead.
Yes, I was curious. I have some letters from Mamie and Ike. They were written to people that I bought a house from, and the people had both died. Their names were Hurlbert, something like that. But anyway, they were left in the house. And I was wondering if I've got nothing to do with them. If I had a place to send them, or an address, you might be able to do something with them.
Mr. Holt, does that bring a smile to your face?
Oh, sure. Just it's very easy address in Abilene. Just send it to the Eisenhower Library, Abilene, Kansas 67410.
When they made the decision to build this center, did they do it on purpose surrounding the boyhood home?
Well, you have to go into the story of this because we predate the presidential library system. And when Mrs. Eisenhower, Ida Eisenhower, died in 1946, there had already been a movement with a group of Abilene citizens and state leaders and, matter of fact, people from across the country to honor General Eisenhower and all veterans of World War II. And there had been a foundation, a nonprofit foundation founded to do that. When Mrs. Eisenhower died, the brothers gave the home to the Eisenhower Foundation to honor the general. And the wing of the museum we're sitting in right now was constructed by them and opened in 1954. Yes, it was important. The home really is the beginning of the Eisenhower Center. And we're the only presidential library that operates the family home as part of our complex.
We're going to go over to that home and meet Dennis Medina. He's the curator of the Eisenhower Museum. Good morning, Mr. Medina.
Good morning, Connie. How are you?
Fine. How old is that house?
It was built in 1887.
And where are you standing?
I'm standing in the front parlor. We're looking around in the house.
And when did Mr. Eisenhower live here?
They moved in here when he was about 8 years old. Actually, they lived in another house in Abilene, which is about a block and a half away. And they moved back from Denison, Texas when he was 2. And Ike lived here until he went to West Point in 1911.
And why were they in Denison, Texas?
His father moved there to work in the railroad.
Let's go over, because one of the things I want to show folks here that was surprising to me was this Bible that's in that room.
Yes, it's a family Bible, and you'll see that someone has written in, and it's probably Ida Eisenhower, has written all the births of the family. It starts out with David Jacob, and the last page entry on that page is D. Dwight Eisenhower. Of course, he was born in 1890. The only boy in the 7 boys that were born to the Eisenhowers that was born outside of Dickinson County, Kansas.
D. Dwight Eisenhower, Mr. Perret. That's not the name we know him as. How did it get changed to Dwight D.?
When he went to West Point, it was, I think, simplified in accordance, shall we say, with custom and practice. People knew him as Dwight, not as D. And who knows, he may have felt there was something slightly pretentious about using an initial instead of your first name.
Mr. Holt, his father's name was David, right?
Yes.
Was there?
Yeah.
Did part of what we do this for was confusion?
I think so. That if you said David, you know, who's going to answer, kind of thing in the family. And I think Mrs. Eisenhower, Ida Eisenhower, always referred to him as Dwight. And there's other conjecture about this and stories, but I'm sure that was a lot of it.
Mr. Medina, where are you now?
I'm now in the back parlor.
And what's there?
Well, there's quite a few things here. This is actually used sort of like a family room would be used today. This was used, the front parlor was just used for company. This was used by the family every day. And the family would sit around here and read the family Bible and also learn how to play the piano. But interesting things here are the needlework material. Pillows that Ida, the president's mother, made, and she embroidered the children's names on them. And also her husbands, David and Ida. And then we have other materials in the house that she bought with her dowry money, a piano that each boy learned how to play. I think that Milton was probably the only one that continued in later life to play the piano.
What kind of music did she like?
Religious music and classical.
Is it true, Mr. Medina, that she took this piano with her all the way to Texas?
She did, and brought it back to Kansas.
The importance, Mr. Perret, of Ida, his mother, to the character and the growing up of Mr. Eisenhower.
Yes.
Eisenhower felt that his mother had shaped his character a lot more than his father had.
Why?
Well, his father was absent most of the time. Even when his father was present, his father was absent. His father would go to work early in the morning at the creamery, only 3 blocks away, and stay there until it was time to come home for dinner. And after dinner, he would disappear into a room and read a book. His mother, however, was the one who, in effect, provided him with what we would call a role model, what a responsible, loving person is like. And she had a similar impact on all of her boys. Ike wasn't the only one who felt that Ida was the greatest influence on their lives.
And Ida and David had how many sons?
Well, the 6 boys, yes.
And how many?
All very successful.
How many older and how many younger than Dwight, David?
Ike is the 3rd.
Were there any children that did not live?
Yes.
How many?
1.
A son?
Yes.
No girls in the lot, huh?
No.
No.
Next call, Armada, Michigan.
Hello.
Good morning, Michigan. Go ahead.
You can hear me all right?
Yes.
Okay, I want to make a couple quick things about myself. My father was born 10 years before Ike's father. I grew up in the Depression. I am a Democrat, but I liked Ike. Roosevelt, my dad lost his home, and he lost his job in the WPA, and able to get a loan to have another home. He saved our family, so I like Roosevelt. Naturally, I served in World War II. My brother made the D-Day landing. I'm going to make a couple of observations. I think that I have the impression that Roosevelt didn't like MacArthur, nor did Truman, and I don't think Eisenhower. I guess one of my main questions is that the difference. Truman was irritated with Eisenhower because it took him so long to criticize McCarthy. I read that Eisenhower actually castigated McCarthy at one time, but Truman saw him up somewhere, I guess Minnesota, campaigning, sitting with Senator McCarthy, and until McCarthy started to attack verbally one of Ike's generals, I believe Eisenhower was one of the men responsible for putting down or getting rid of McCarthy. I guess that is my main question. Enjoy your program.
Thanks very much. Mr. Perret, your reaction to that?
Eisenhower has often been criticized for not standing up for General Marshall. When Eisenhower went to Wisconsin in 1952 to campaign, he shared a platform with McCarthy. He had intended originally to include a paragraph in his speech in which he would defend General Marshall against the criticisms of people like McCarthy, because McCarthy had called General Marshall a traitor, which was absolutely outrageous. And Eisenhower had got himself into a position where he couldn't possibly win. If he criticized McCarthy, he was going to stir up a civil war within the Republican Party. And electors do not like to vote for parties that are divided, in effect, against themselves. So he would jeopardize the chances of a Republican victory in the election if he attacked McCarthy on that platform. On the other hand, by not saying anything about General Marshall, Eisenhower was going to look bad in the eyes of history for not standing up for one of the greatest Americans there's ever been, and a man to whom Eisenhower owed a great deal. Eisenhower's big mistake was going to Wisconsin. He was advised, you don't have to go to Wisconsin, stay out of Wisconsin, stay away from this. But once he got there, he was in a situation, as I say, where he could not possibly come up with a good solution to the McCarthy problem. That had to wait until Eisenhower became president, and Eisenhower was instrumental in the destruction of Joe McCarthy.
Mr. Holt, we just showed a picture of Eisenhower in a motorcade standing. Was that normal?
Yes.
Why did he do it that way?
He liked to relate to the people, and he used to remark on how tired it made your arms when you did that on a lengthy trip. But then you didn't worry as much about security either if you were president. And he liked to ride in the open cars and meet people.
Beasley's Point, New Jersey. You're next. Good morning.
Hi. I was wondering why Eisenhower was against the Indian New Deal and tried to terminate many tribes.
And tried to terminate what?
Many Indian tribes.
Mr. Perret, is that true?
Not as far as I'm aware of. I don't know that Eisenhower wanted to destroy any Indian tribes.
Surprises you. How about you, Mr. Holt?
Yeah, never heard that one.
Back over to Mr. Medina, who's over in the family home. Where are you at now?
We're in the dining room, which is the largest room in the house. This house originally had 6 rooms, 3 upstairs and 3 downstairs. And the dining room at one time was also the kitchen. And in At Ease, Ike talks about making pie dough with his brothers in here, and pretty soon they'd start horseplaying, and pretty soon the dough would be a little brown from dropping on the floor of their dirty hands.
Show us the picture in the corner of the family.
Sure, that's an image of the family in 1902. There were 7 boys born to the Eisenhower family. 1 died at the age of 1, and that was Paul. DDE, Ike, is in the left corner, and then his brother Edgar, and then Earl, Arthur, Roy in that back row, and then the parents, David, and then Milton, who has long sausage curls. Victorian days, little boys didn't have their hair cut until they went to school, and then the president's mother.
And if you go over then to the right, you see a later picture of the same family in the same places?
Right, 1926. And Arthur was a banker, Edgar a lawyer, Roy, who lived in Junction City, was a pharmacist, and Earl was a publisher of a newspaper. And Milton, of course, was president of 3 universities, Kansas State University, Penn State University, and Johns Hopkins.
We also have in one of the other buildings some of the pictures of some of the brothers as they did. Milton Eisenhower, is he a well-known name in Kansas?
Yes, mainly because of his presidency at Kansas State. Of course, well known as comparative. Today we have people ask us how you spell Eisenhower, so we hope that's changing. But Milton, of course, had the longest resume of the entire group. One interesting thing about Milton that most people don't realize was he did the War Relocation Authority for about a year, which was the internment of the Japanese from the West Coast. But he quit after about 11 months because he understood the reasons for it, but he didn't like the methods.
Mr. Prey,
he's a fascinating man.
Mr. Prey, you write in your book that Milton was the one who was, is it fair to say, the soulmate of the president during his presidential years?
Yes. Ike and Milton were an almost perfect example of brotherhood in action. There was implicit confidence and trust between them. And as he lay dying, almost the last thing Eisenhower said was he had Milton bend down because Eisenhower couldn't raise his voice. And he gestured to Milton, and he said, "I want you to know what your counsel has meant to me."
I also want to ask you about the brother Edgar. What role did he play in terms of his relationship with his brother and growing up?
I would say Edgar was the second greatest influence on the formation of Dwight David Eisenhower's character. Edgar was bigger, stronger. He's the older brother. And the sibling rivalry between those two is a book in itself. Edgar had a lot to do with putting the grit into Ike's soul.
What happened to Edgar, Mr. Holt?
Well, I'll refer this back to Jeff because he's done more on it. I think the one aspect we're missing here was the golf game in this.
Edgar was a much better golfer than Dwight. And because he had a problem with his knee, Eisenhower was never going to be a really good golfer. Well, Eisenhower couldn't resist playing golf with Edgar, and Edgar thrashed him every time. It was like a moth to the flame. He just couldn't stay. He was desperate to beat Edgar at golf, and he never succeeded. Next
is Los Angeles. Hello.
Good morning. I have a couple of quick points that I want to touch up on. First of all, if they could comment as far as did Dwight D. Eisenhower's presidential bid have anything to do with Truman not reconsidering a bid for the White House? And if you could comment on the margins of the 1952 election as opposed to the margins of the 1956, and why he chose Richard Nixon as a vice presidential running mate. One of my most famous quotes that I love from Eisenhower is when, in 1960, when Richard Nixon was running for president, and they asked him, "What did you think of the vice president? Was he ever consulted on any affairs?" Eisenhower replied, "Well, if you give me a week, I might think of something."
Let's go back. Let's take first with the decision about Richard Nixon.
Eisenhower didn't choose Richard Nixon. Richard Nixon was chosen by the Republican Party leadership, mostly by Thomas Dewey, who was instrumental in getting Eisenhower into the campaign, and especially in running Eisenhower's campaign. But Nixon was essentially chosen for him. And Eisenhower never took to Nixon. He never particularly liked him. He never trusted him. He called him a loser. The whole 8 years Eisenhower was in the White House, Nixon was never invited to come up to the family quarters. Nixon played golf. Eisenhower was always asking people to play golf with him. He never asked Nixon to play golf with him.
And what about this whole idea of when he made a decision to run for president, did Truman have an impact on that? And then a little bit about the margins in the 52 and 56 elections.
I'm not sure about the Truman impact. I'm really not. I haven't studied that part of Eisenhower that closely. Jeff has some in his book about it.
Truman had nothing to do with it, but Taft had a lot to do with it. Eisenhower, it was a Republican year, assuming the Republicans didn't do something incredibly stupid, like have a civil war within their own party. And the thought that an isolationist like Taft might become president was just more than Eisenhower could stand. He thought the security of the United States and the whole Western world would be at risk if Taft became president.
Back over to Dennis Medina, who is in the home where Eisenhower grew up. When did he leave this home, Mr. Medina?
1911, when he went to West Point.
And what was that like, leaving at this home for him?
Oh, I would imagine it was very difficult, you know, going to a faraway place as West Point, New York, and catching the train. He did stop over in Chicago and spent the night there and saw some old friends there.
Dennis Medina is going to be joining us a little bit later over in the other part, talking about Mamie Eisenhower. We'll see him back then. Mr. Perret, after looking at this home, you talk in your book a little bit about somewhat of the myth of the poverty of the Eisenhowers. Was there a myth about how poor they were?
They were desperately poor when they were in Denison, Texas, but by the time they came here to this charming house on 3 acres of land, although they didn't have much cash, I wouldn't say they were really poor. They could grow large amounts of food for themselves, and their cash needs were comparatively small. They had to be careful with every dime, but I wouldn't say they were truly poor. But as Eisenhower rose into the stratosphere, it added to the story, but to exaggerate how humble his origins were. It increased the distance between the presidency and this house.
This is the cover of Mr. Perret's book, and this is what we're going to talk about next, his period at West Point. Where did they find this photo?
Well, the art director at Random House found the photograph. I cannot claim credit for that, but here is Eisenhower looking like Elvis as a beautiful young man.
Mr. Holt, how did he get into West Point?
Actually, he wrote to the Kansas senator, U.S. senator, who lives just about 25 miles west of Abilene, wanting to get into either Annapolis or West Point, and a longtime friend of his had really persuaded him to go to Annapolis. He had a difficulty with his age on it, and basically he doesn't tell the truth when he does the applications for it. Annapolis had a different entrance age. The style broke, but it was a matter of a U.S. senatorial appointment, and really he went because it was a free education.
He met Swede Hazlitt.
Right.
Swede Hazlitt was at a military academy or getting ready to go take the test for one?
Swede Hazlitt had his heart set on going to Annapolis and had flunked the math section of the Annapolis entrance exam and had come back to do some revision before he took the exam again, and he put the idea into Eisenhower's head that the military academy will give you a good, free college education. Free was essential.
Yes.
The senator that he applied to was a Republican? Is that correct?
Oh, yes. Well, in Kansas in those days, you wouldn't have been in office if you weren't a Republican, yeah.
Did that cause him any qualms about whether he would be chosen for the military academy?
Well, Eisenhower's first party political loyalty was as a Democrat.
Right.
And he gave a speech at Working Men's Hall in Abilene saying that the Republicans are the party of the rich, the Democrats are the party of the people, and then a few months later he's applying to a Republican senator for a West Point appointment. And fortunately, this is a forgiving town.
Bill, Silver Spring, Maryland, you're next. Hello.
Hello, thank you. During the war, the general faced problems both on the battlefield and among his staff particularly people like Montgomery. And I'm wondering, in the judgment of your guests, what was the general's most significant World War II achievement? Thank you.
Mr. Holt?
This varies a lot because it depends on your interpretation of what's a significant achievement in battle or in overall strategy. A lot of people, of course, say the organization and implementation of the invasion of Normandy. There are others who think that the Battle of the Bulge and Eisenhower's reaction to that may have been his greatest moment in World War II. To me, they're both very important. But I think when you look at the difficulty of this organization of SHAEF, the Supreme Headquarters at a time period, a man who organized a group of, some of them prima donnas, some of them very cooperative, but it's a combination of things. It's very difficult to select out any one item as the greatest, but I tend to agree in some ways with historians who look at, as far as the combative side of the war, that the Battle of the Bulge may well have been one of the high points of his military command during that war.
How would you describe his relationship with General Montgomery?
Difficult, but that's always the case when you have a relationship that is founded on mutual contempt.
Why was it founded on mutual contempt?
Eisenhower and Montgomery did not think alike about military problems. Montgomery believed that was because Montgomery, had seen service on the Western Front in World War I, and Eisenhower hadn't. Eisenhower, to him, was just a staff officer. Eisenhower, however, was probably one of the 4 or 5 foremost military thinkers of World War II. Eisenhower's greatest achievement, I believe, was that he saw the possibilities for combined arms and joint operations far ahead of almost anyone else, and certainly ahead of Montgomery. Eisenhower was always looking at the future of war. He wasn't interested in refighting the battles of the past. And Eisenhower is almost the first high-ranking officer to see how, by integrating everything, not just armor and dive bombers as the Germans had done for Blitzkrieg, but by putting the whole of the army on tracks and wheels so that nobody has to walk, by having a whole range of aircraft, and you integrate those with the ground operations, and you make sure that everybody, in effect, is working as part of a team. You don't have the military services going essentially in their separate directions and more or less cooperating when a war comes. Eisenhower wanted to put everybody in the same uniform. He saw this as being essentially the same job with specialties within it. Someone like Montgomery didn't see that. Eisenhower understood air power better than any infantryman in history because Eisenhower was a pilot. So I would say that Eisenhower was thinking on a much more elevated plane than Montgomery. Montgomery was just the soldier. Eisenhower was both a soldier and a thinker. And the way that warfare has evolved since 1945 has shown that Eisenhower's belief in combined arms operations and joint operations is indeed the epitome of modern warfare. So Eisenhower is a very modern general, whereas Montgomery, to my mind, was still, in effect, a World War I general.
Mr. Holt, in your museum here, you have a table where
Yes.
D-Day was planned. Tell us a little bit about it.
Well, it's to say D-Day was planned on it maybe is an overstatement, but most of the meetings that the combatant chiefs had were around that table. The version we have in the museum right now is much smaller. We have other leaves that go in the table. It is Chippendale, and I've told some people before the British only planned their wars in the very best, so they used the Chippendale. But it was presented to General Eisenhower after the war.
This is the book that is edited by our guest, Dan Holt. It is what, Mr. Holt?
It's Eisenhower, the Pre-War Diaries and Selected Papers, which covers the years from 1905 to 1941. I had an associate editor on the book, too, James Lyrzaf, here in the library, who assisted with it. But it's mainly just a selection from his diaries and his papers before the war. It's quite revealing because there's a lot of depth to the man I think people have missed in the past by not looking at that early career.
How long have you been the director of the center here?
9 years.
And you grew up where?
In Kansas. Yeah.
Where in
Right.
Kansas?
In Hoyt, north of Topeka, about 12 miles.
Population?
Well, when I grew up there, it was about 100 to 120, but it's become a booming metropolis now of about 600 or 700. So I don't recognize it any longer.
Mr. Prey, how many years did you work on this book?
Depends on how you count it, Connie. I wrote a book on the Army Air Forces in World War II. I wrote a book on the Army in World War II. I also wrote a military history of the United States from the Revolution to Vietnam. I wrote a biography of MacArthur. Eisenhower spent 7 years working for MacArthur. So by the time I had done that, I'd covered, I think, most of the background, and I'd also written a social and political history of the United States from 1945 to 1963, so I'd already covered the 1950s, the political issues of the time. So it took me 2.5 years to write the book, but all I had to do was concentrate on Eisenhower. Otherwise, it would have taken me 6 or 7, I should imagine.
Our viewers may remember you from your book notes appearance on your biography on Ulysses S. Grant. Is there any kind of connection between Ulysses S. Grant and Dwight David Eisenhower?
Well, Eisenhower admired Grant. That is the connection. I'm afraid I can't say it's the other way around.
Next, Charlotte, North Carolina.
Hi, I have 2 political questions for you, if I might. Back during the campaigns of 52 and 56, Eisenhower had to face Adlai Stevenson in both of those elections. That was almost unprecedented in American history to have to go against the same candidate twice. What was that like during those campaigns? What did Eisenhower truly think about Stevenson, and maybe vice versa, if you could? And also talk a little bit more why the Republican Party decided on Richard Nixon as that running mate. If they didn't have that great of a relationship, why Nixon? And how did Eisenhower help Nixon any in the 60 election? Thank you very much.
Mr. Holt, you want to take those first?
Well, I'll comment on the Nixon just to follow up what we said earlier. Politics, you know, as they say, make strange bedfellows, and they needed California. I mean, let's face it, politically, and they needed the Western votes that Nixon could bring. And like Jeff said earlier, that decision was made by the Republican Party, not by Eisenhower. And it was true political strategy.
Leesburg, Florida, you're next. We're going to continue as we take a look a little bit around this area. We've been calling it a campus since we got here, and that's probably...
That's fine with us.
Is that okay?
Yeah. Oh, yeah.
I mean, it kind of looks like a Midwest campus. How many acres here?
We have 22, yeah. And we're a little unique in the libraries because we have separate buildings for the library and the museum. Now, the Ford Presidential Library Museum is separated in 2 cities, so we're a little closer than that. But it is a campus. There's actually 6 buildings when you count the maintenance building, the place of meditation, the burial site, the home, the library, and the museum, and a visitor center. And it's a beautiful grounds, especially right now. When
did Ike decide that he wanted this to happen?
Well, according to the old Eisenhower Foundation records, on this, when they started to raise the money to build this first wing, there was not yet a presidential library system. Eisenhower signs the federal act creating the presidential library system. We know that he'd actually written a letter to one of the organizers of that he would designate Abilene as the home for his presidential papers.
Leesburg, Florida, you're next.
Yes, Bob Burns here. I have read quite a bit on Eisenhower, but not Mr. Perez's new book, so I'm going to get that. If there was a candidate for the century as a leader and a real American with ethics, would we not consider Dwight D. Eisenhower the man of the year or man of the century?
Mr. Perez.
That's a good question. I would certainly rate him very highly. I would also rate Franklin Roosevelt very highly. I would have no quarrel with putting Eisenhower among, say, the 3 best presidents, because Eisenhower was he was not just a very good president, he was a very good man.
I'm looking here trying to find, because I know that there was a 1962 presidential ranking that came up.
Yeah.
Eisenhower was still alive.
Yes.
He ranked 22nd.
22nd, yeah.
Was he happy about that?
There's been a lot more. I don't know. I doubt it.
He was cut to the quick by that.
Here I have it. 22nd out of 31, just above Andrew Johnson and just below Chester Arthur.
Right.
Yes, but that poll had been organized by Arthur Schlesinger, and it was really an attempt to mark out a little territory early on for John F. Kennedy. Eisenhower was incensed, and he made a list of the achievements of his administration, and it was not for publication, but he had to get this off his chest. He made up a list of the things that he had accomplished, or his administration had accomplished, and he circulated it among his friends and people who had been part of that administration. And I think it was both therapy for him, and it was a way of him saying to them, look, it doesn't matter what this poll shows. We did a good job, and I want you to know that I think you did a good job.
Dan Hope?
Yeah, I'll make a comment on it. I actually have appeared on a couple of panel discussions and history meetings on these polls or rankings of presidents, which none of us on the panels agreed with, but they're an interesting exercise. Of course, today, now the more recent polls, that Eisenhower has moved up consistently into the top 7 or 8, sometimes in the top 5. There's a reason for that. Number one is a lot of papers are becoming declassified today, are much more open to what they were, and people are beginning to understand how difficult it was to control the Cold War, among other things. But so as you get further away from a presidency, you get a better assessment of that presidency. And with him, we had so many records that were classified because of the Cold War period, but now those are beginning to open up.
And some new tapes coming out?
Well, we have 2 sets. Well, they're not tapes. In Eisenhower's Oval Office, they're dictabelts. And we actually located some a couple of years ago with the help of a researcher that were recorded in the Oval Office, as we now refer to as tapes. Matter of fact, two or three of them are very good. And for one thing, he's talking about the Bricker Amendment in one of them, which there's still debate in Congress periodically. Some of them are quite humorous. But we are now in the process of transcribing his dictation that he did on dictabelts. But it's very difficult because the equipment no longer exists. And we have to go to the Dictaphone Corporation. They have to jerry-rig equipment to do it. But it's wonderful to hear, a president in the Oval Office.
Did Richard Nixon know that Eisenhower was taping him?
I don't know. Yeah, possibly he did, but I just don't know.
Yeah, he's not on any of the technology then was so difficult. The dictabelts that are made in the Oval Office, if anybody turns their head or walks away, you can't hear them. And you can hear all the desk noise and things like that, and sometimes they weren't sure they had the machine on or off. So it's, but it's like I say, it's wonderful to have those recordings. And of course now we have the tapes that were conversations between President Johnson and President Kennedy and President Eisenhower that were taped in the Kennedy and Johnson years, and those are really a very valuable addition to the Eisenhower bibliography. Really are.
Dwight David Eisenhower was buried here in 1969. How long did Mamie live after that?
About 10 years.
And then she's buried here also?
Yes, she is.
And how did Icky's body come to be buried here also?
They brought him back here from Denver. Yeah.
We'll take a look at the place of meditation where all that is, where those 3 people are buried, as we go next to California. Hello, California.
Hello. I was in the Army Air Corps at Wright Field during the war in Dayton, Ohio, and I was reading the Dayton papers, and there's a apparent conflict in the crusade for Europe. Eisenhower explained the repatriation of the Russian and the Polish prisoners against their will because of Yalta, yet the repatriation actually started in January, a month before Yalta. How do our historians explain this?
Mr. Prey?
Because it's national policy, and national policy comes from the president.
Next is Cleveland.
Yes. Thank you very much. We sure are enjoying this wonderful series on C-SPAN. My question is regarding Marshall's trip to China after the war and McCarthy's reaction to it, which apparently caused a falling out between Truman and Eisenhower. I need more details on this, please. Thank you.
Either one of you, Mr. Prey? Here comes the train.
Once the Southern Pacific is has given us a chance here. Well, Marshall was sent to China on a completely hopeless mission to try to mediate between the Chinese communists and the Kuomintang. And Marshall meant a lot in the United States, and he meant a lot, I suppose, in Europe, but he meant absolutely nothing in China. And when he came back, he had, in effect, failed in that mission. But Eisenhower had already decided that he didn't like Truman long before that, although Truman continued to like Eisenhower. Much of their disagreement stemmed from a personality clash, a difference of temperament. As well, later on, when Eisenhower was campaigning in 1952 for the presidency, of course, then their political disagreements came out. But the fundamental problem between Eisenhower and Truman was that Truman was cutting the military more rapidly after World War II than Eisenhower thought was prudent. And he was cutting the military budget to a point that Eisenhower thought was dangerous and was inviting Soviet adventurism.
Oakland, California.
Hello.
You're on the air. Go ahead.
Yes, this is Mrs. Harris, and I was listening to one of the guys there talking about Eisenhower, that he had some letters from Major Hobart, Eisenhower's personal bodyguard, and I wanted to talk to him about that.
Go ahead. What do you want to ask?
I wanted to ask him, let him know who I am and talk to him about further information, and maybe I have further information for him.
Okay, go ahead. What I think we'll do, caller, is ask you to leave your phone number, and Mr. Holt can call you later. Do you have some letters for him?
So what?
Do you have some letters for him?
Do I have some letters for him?
Yes.
I have letters from Eisenhower, that he wrote my uncle during that time. But he has some letters from, he said a black guy was Eisenhower's personal bodyguard, and that was my uncle.
Okay. Thanks. Highland, Indiana is next. Go ahead, Highland, Indiana.
Hi, my name's George Nelson. I'm a former history teacher, great admirer of C-SPAN's presidential history series. And I admired Eisenhower in his dealing with the military when he was president. I have a question. There was a book 4 or 5 years ago by a Canadian author. He attacked General Eisenhower for treatment of German POWs in the Savage Winter right after the war. He claimed that treatment was not fair. I wondered if your historians would comment on that.
Mr. Craig?
Again, thank you for C-SPAN's history series.
Thanks.
Enjoyed them very much.
Yes, excuse me. The caller is referring to Other Losses, a book by James Barr, who maintained that Eisenhower quite, deliberately allowed up to 1 million German prisoners of war to starve at the end of World War II. That in effect he was punishing the Germans by maltreating their prisoners. The German government had looked into this issue in the 1950s and found that in fact only 50,000 German POWs died in Allied hands from malnutrition and the diseases associated with malnutrition. As there were over 5 million German prisoners in American hands at that time, this represented a loss of 1%. Now, what is interesting is that the Germans did their best at times to feed, clothe, and house Allied POWs. They didn't treat captured Russians the same way. And the loss rate in the German camps of Allied POWs was 1%. The Germans, you might say, well, we should have done better with the Germans. But there was, in fact, a food shortage in Western Europe at the end of the war. And even before the war ended, Eisenhower was wondering how he was going to feed the Americans and British soldiers who had been, in effect, liberated. Once their camps were taken, he had just enough food to make sure his own army was fed. He was going to have hundreds of thousands of liberated Allied POWs to feed to. He was worried about feeding them. So they knew there were going to be problems. They did what they could to alleviate them. The idea that Eisenhower and members of the SHAEF staff deliberately starved and maltreated German prisoners simply doesn't stand up. There is no evidence whatever for it. That whole back book was based on the misunderstanding of one single Army colonel who misunderstood what other losses meant in Army records. What he didn't realize was that it meant in most cases that this man has been transferred from this camp to another camp. But he went down in a column called Other Losses, and prisoners were being moved from camp to camp. So during the course of that winter, 1 million prisoners were moved. 1 million prisoners were not starved to death.
Mr. Holt, this all kind of comes back again.
Yeah, a lot of them just actually went home. But like Jeff said, when you look at the military record-keeping systems, if they didn't fit in categories 1 through 10, it was all other. And Steve Ambrose, right after that book came out, Steve Ambrose wrote a very definitive article about the publication and looked at the stats again. So I suggest, if the gentleman would like to see that, we'd be glad to send it to him if he'd send his name and address to him.
And I think it came up again in the articles written in the aftermath of Pat Buchanan's book. I've seen some references to it again. Next call, Chesapeake, Virginia. Hello.
I wanted to ask either of the speakers specifically what role the Augusta National Golf Club had in electing then General Eisenhower to the presidency, specific Clifford Roberts' influence on the general, and just the club in general, what kind of effect it had in the president's lives. Thanks for the call, and wish Eisenhower was still around.
Thanks very much. Mr. Holt, one of the things that I read said that golf was the metaphor for Eisenhower's presidency. Is that true?
Yeah, unfortunately, he played less golf than Woodrow Wilson did and a variety of other presidents. But to get to Augusta, it's an interesting question. Augusta television station just within the past year has done a special called Ike's Augusta, which they interview a lot of the people. And, of course, we have Mr. Roberts' oral history here. Certainly an influence. The Eisenhower cabinet at Augusta is, there were a lot of poker games went on, a lot of money raised for the Republican Party, and Mamie thoroughly enjoyed visiting there as well. You have to remember that the Masters golf tournament was not a major golf tournament until Eisenhower actually began to live there, and he and Arnold Palmer became acquainted, and then the growth, and it all became well known. But Augusta is a very important meeting place for the network there. Yeah, it's interesting. Of course, Eisenhower's outlook on golf was that if I mishit the golf ball, the world didn't blow up. So it was a good way to relax.
What did golf have as an impact on his personality, or his personality have on the impact on his golf game? Maybe it's the better question, huh, Mr. Bray?
Well, golf was certainly a reminder that you might be president, you might be the most powerful man in the world, but you're still a fallible human being. And you cannot have everything you want in life. Eisenhower had bursitis in his left shoulder. He has in his right shoulder. He has bursitis in his left knee. You're playing against your left knee when you swing a golf club, and he couldn't overcome that. And that kind of thing, I think, can, given the right temperament, be very character building, because it reminds you of something. The competition is really with yourself. And Eisenhower had to do the best he can, despite the bursitis, despite the bad knee. This was something that he really enjoyed. I also suspect, and this is probably completely unscientific, I suspect golf helped keep him alive.
Because of the exercise?
Because of the exercise, and because it was a way of getting away from the pressures of the Oval Office. There was one evening he left, he said, I think I'll go and find a tall building. Well, he didn't have to leave up a tall building. He had golf. And every president, everybody under that, anything like that kind of pressure needs some kind of release. And most Americans recognized it. When the question was put to them in a poll, do you think the president plays too much golf? They said no. And they were right. He played just enough golf to stay alive and concentrate on the people's business.
Did he play golf everywhere?
Yes. Well, everywhere he could.
I mean, during the war?
Oh, yeah. During, we have photographs of him in World War II actually playing at the old course, in St. Andrews. And actually, I think at Turnberry, which became a British Air Force field, and I think the Americans flew in there, too. Any chance he got,
he here on a USS.
Yeah. Any chance he got, he would play golf. I think, too, that he looked upon golf as something to really be good at it, you have to do it exactly the same way every time, and he knew that was impossible. So you accept those impossibilities along with the game. And it was a great relief for him.
How did he hurt his leg?
Well, it depends on which injury we're talking about. The youthful injury was he fell down and skinned his knee real bad and ran some splinters into it, and actually had blood poisoning. You know,
What age?
I don't remember what year it was now.
It had been, what, 12?
12, I guess, yeah. And they wanted to amputate the leg. And he and Milton actually supported not having it amputated, and then the family went along with it. So he missed a year of school because of that. Then, of course, the West Point injury with football.
The Tufts game?
Yeah.
Yeah, no, he was 14 when he. That's right. He missed his first year at
in the blood with the blood poisoning.
Right.
Yes.
Yeah, the Tufts game. Jim Thorpe did not tackle him, which is one of the stories.
No, I mean,
that goes
if you're
around
going to have your knee wrecked, you want Jim Thorpe to do it.
That's
Unfortunately,
right.
it didn't turn out.
Another apocryphal.
That's right. His knee was wrecked by someone whose name is lost to history.
That's right.
And, I mean, is it possible that if his knee hadn't been wrecked, he wouldn't have taken the path that he did?
I think it's very possible. But you never know. You never know with things like that. He could have come out of West Point as a football hero and still ended up as a five-star general. Bradley did that.
Right.
Tracy, California, you're next.
I was at the Eisenhower Library in 1976, and I remember seeing a letter displayed there from Harry Truman to Dwight Eisenhower, saying to Dwight Eisenhower very pointedly that it was very important that an isolationist not be elected president in the upcoming term, which would be about 1951 or so that the letter was dated, as I recall. And so I was a little bit surprised when there wasn't more discussion of Truman's influence on Eisenhower in running for president.
Mr. Holt.
I wouldn't really. I don't think Truman was that much of an influence in his decision to run for president. I think it may have been one of the few things they agreed on was isolationism. You can see what Jeff thinks about it, but
Mr. Prey, how did Eisenhower become a candidate in 1952?
Oh, that's different.
He became a candidate in 1952 mainly to stop Robert Taft getting the Republican nomination, because had Taft got the nomination, he would very likely have been elected, and Eisenhower saw that as a threat to the security of the entire free world. Taft did not recognize the importance of creating a strong and united, a Europe that was strong and united in the defense of Western values. Taft really believed that America was so rich and so powerful that it didn't need to get involved in Europe. And if the United States should get involved with foreign countries, that the Pacific was much more important to American security than Western Europe. And Eisenhower believed that a Taft election was dangerous. He felt that he had really very little alternative.
Thinking about presidential elections today and then thinking back to 1952 and considering today that a candidate would walk forward and both the Democrats and Republicans would want them to represent that party, it seems like an impossibility today. How did it happen with Ike?
Well, candidates, of course, dream of that kind of thing. The irony is the one man it happened to, he didn't want to run for president. Yeah. But there's no history without irony.
Next is is it Valdosta, Georgia?
Yes, Valdosta.
Good morning.
Lowndes County, Georgia.
Welcome.
Okay, before the election in 1952, I was on Korean orders, so I voted an absentee ballot in my home county. Of course, I voted for Eisenhower. When I got to Korea, I was assigned to the Great 3rd Infantry Division, and I received a personal introduction to then Major John S.D. Eisenhower, Eisenhower's son. In early 1953, the major making the introduction remarked that Major Eisenhower was shortly to return to the States to be at his father's inauguration, and he asked me, what I thought about that. And of course, I was, I was awed. So I said, "Well, that's fine by me." So, like I say, I think both of those men, both Generals Eisenhower were some of the finest Americans we've ever had.
Thanks, caller. First, the impact that Eisenhower had, if at all, in 1952 campaign on the end of the Korean War.
I've had people in the Citizens for Eisenhower group, and including his campaign manager, Herbert Brownell, tell me it's the most important statement he made during the campaign was, "I will go to Korea." I'd always underestimated this, until I've heard this from some of the people in the campaign. He didn't say what he was going to do when he got there, and really had not made pronouncements on how he would end the war. War in my terminology, anyway. But it was somebody had offered to do something, to go to Korea and look at it, and you have to remember, here's the old soldier, here's the man that won World War II in Europe for us. There was, it had a major impact that he would be willing to go.
Mr. Prey, we were just looking at the photo of the son of Eisenhower, John S.D. Eisenhower, a military man in his own right?
Oh, yes. Yes, and he has what every infantryman wants, a combat infantryman's badge. That is considered the proof that a man is a complete soldier. Because you don't get a combat infantryman badge because a committee sits around and decides whether you should get one or not. The way a lot of decorations are handed out, there's a slightly political element, shall we say. And nobody gets a combat infantry badge without deserving it.
The only living son, or child, rather, of Mamie and Ike Eisenhower, John S.D. Eisenhower, sat down for an interview with us. You're going to see the complete interview a little bit later this week. But right now we'd like to show you a little bit of a video clip from it in which he talks about his father's personality.
In public, he appeared quite affable. Matter of fact, he used his famous grin as sort of a device. But it downgraded him a little bit because he was not that one-sided. He was a very complicated man, and he was very serious. Now, the people that worked at the White House saw him as he really was, or in a military unit saw him as he really was. But as far as the public's concerned, he was thought of as affable. And I think there's at times a lack of appreciation of how busy and driving he was.
Before we talk about his content, we have to remark on how much his son looks like his father. Yes. That's pretty amazing.
It is astounding. Because I only saw General Eisenhower once when I was in the Army. I was on Okinawa, and Eisenhower was making one of his trips, and he couldn't go to Japan. He came to Okinawa. And when, some years later, I met John Eisenhower at his home, and the sun was going down over the water that you could see in the background of that interview. And his face was getting pinker, and Eisenhower, the president, had a very pink face. And as the sun was going down, and John's eyes are getting bluer and bluer, and his face is getting pinker and pinker, and his hair is getting whiter and whiter, I thought, it's him! It's him! It was a very spooky experience. But John is really his own man. But there are times when he does look astonishingly like his father.
Mr. Hull, you were telling us a story about what happened on D-Day with the son. Not on D-Day, but with the Normandy 50 years later.
In '94, when John got out of the vehicle that was driving him, this was at the unveiling of the statue of his father in Caen. He stepped out of that vehicle, and about 4,000 or 5,000 French people had a gasp all at once, when they saw him. I mean, here he is. I mean, this is General Eisenhower back. So it was a remarkable experience.
If you've been to Cannes, if you've been to London, and where else would you see a statue kind of like the one that you have out here?
West Point.
West Point?
Yeah.
All done by the same
Robert
sculptor?
Dean. And the statue here was was placed in 1985. Here. And they're all a little different because this statue has to be copyrighted by the people who gave it to the center. So, but very good likeness. It's a very good statue.
And the one in London is where?
At the American Embassy.
And the one in Cannes is on the battleground there?
No, it's in a turnaround on the east edge of town, and General de Gaulle is on the other side of town, the turnaround.
The content of what John S.D. Eisenhower was saying about the personality of his father.
Yes, well, that was your very first question. I said it's difficult to get at Eisenhower's inner life, and it's true. But it is like landing on an unknown continent. And the further you go, at first you think, well, maybe I'm just on a beach. And then, well, maybe this is an island. And you get further and further into it, and you start to wonder just how big it is. And in the end, Eisenhower had a big personality because he was not a simple man. There are people with big personalities who really are comparatively simple people. But Eisenhower was exactly the opposite. He was a big man because there was a lot there.
Some people call him simple. Some people call him anti-intellectual.
Yes.
Would you agree with any of those?
No. I wouldn't call him anti-intellectual. I would say he was not an intellectual in that he did not pursue abstract thought very far. Like most generals and politicians, life comes to him as a set of problems to be solved. And he was very good at solving the problems.
Let me ask you this, and this is a quote from Richard Nixon, in which he said, he, meaning Eisenhower, usually preferred indirect approach to a problem where it would serve him better than the direct attack on a problem. Is that fair?
But that reflects his military training. They say in the Army, you fight as you train. Well, it's the same thing. You think, to a large degree, as you've been taught to think. His approach to a problem was essentially the Army's approach. You don't go straight at an objective. And he once explained this to Ezra Taft Benson, his Secretary of Agriculture. Agriculture was one of the intractable problems then, still is. And he said, and Benson was one of the elders of the Mormon Church. And Ezra Taft Benson wanted to go at the farm problem head on. And Eisenhower took a yellow legal tablet. He said, Ezra, sometimes you have to do it this way. He said, now here, and he drew a box at the top. He said, this is your objective. Down at the bottom of this circle, this is where you're starting from. He said, you may have to feint to the right. You may have to come over to the left. You may have to outmaneuver on this plane. And he drew this sinuous, meandering line all over the page before it finally reached the box at the top, to make his point that sometimes it's the only way you can do it. You have to approach the problem indirectly if you're actually going to solve it.
Next call, Philadelphia.
Good morning. I'd like to ask your guests two questions. I'd like to know if they are familiar with the Atoms for Peace program that Eisenhower initiated during his presidency, and what a great political blunder it was, where America gave atomic technology to India for peaceful purposes, and instead India first developed and then detonated an atomic bomb, much to the shock and surprise of the American government. And I'd like to know if they consider this one of the greatest political blunders or political misjudgments of the 20th century, and where they think that this falls compared to other mistakes that Americans may have made in the 20th century.
Thank you. Mr. Holt.
I'm not that familiar with what she's talking about.
I
know what she's saying, but we weren't really giving them the process.
Mr. Prey?
Or it was just
Eisenhower recognized that countries that wanted and needed cheap electricity, which means most of the countries in the world, were at some point going to attempt to build nuclear power stations. Others weren't even interested in the atom for nuclear power. They would want to build atomic weapons. And Eisenhower wanted to convince countries that didn't have atomic weapons that they could have atomic power without developing atomic weapons. Unfortunately, it's very difficult to separate the two. Now, even without American help, China got nuclear weapons. There are now something like 17 to 25 countries that within 3 years could build an atomic weapon if they really wanted to. Eisenhower was trying to steer the development of atomic science down a peaceful path. Had he stood aside and not at least tried to do that, he would have been blamed and criticized for not doing it. The Atoms for Peace proposal was a very good idea, but like very many ideas, you cannot follow through and make sure that you control the implications of those ideas, the working out of those ideas. But nuclear weapons and nuclear plants have spread around the globe. That was going to happen. He couldn't stop it. He just tried to have some influence on it.
Yeah, that was what I was referring. He didn't intentionally give them nuclear weapon processes. I mean, this is the whole effort of the Atoms for Peace, was to help people use atomic power for peaceful purposes. Like Jeff said, though, it's very easy. I suppose you can build a bomb off the internet today, but it's the same kind of thing.
Irvine, California, hello.
Yes, good morning. I was reading a 57 issue of Family Circle magazine, and it speaks at length about his great love of cooking and references that Mamie used to put cookbooks on his bedstand in the White House so that he might read them when he went to bed. I'm wondering if that's true and if you can expand upon that.
A cooking president.
Yes. Apparently in the World War II, he toured the kitchens, made recipe suggestions, and said, I'd like to be remembered as the chief of staff who did something about the Army's cooking because it's part of their pay, and none of his pay should go to counterfeit, is his term. And his son John, in 47, went to the cook and baker school at Fort Benning so that he, too, could be more aware of what was going on with the military cooking.
Thanks, Irvine. Mr. Holt, can you help us with that?
Yeah, he did. He loved to cook. Matter of fact, we just acquired recently the stove from the White House. It was up in the private quarters, and when we get the Presidential Gallery restored, you're going to see the stove that he made his sometimes famous or infamous vegetable soup on, and everybody tested. But yeah, he loved to cook.
Where'd that come from,
Especially
Mr.
to burn up steaks on the grill outside.
Well, this is part of the legacy of Ida.
Right.
Eisenhower made all of the boys do chores. They did so many chores your mind can go blank just reading the list of chores that they had to do. And Eisenhower was the only one who had the sense to discover that there was a lot of happiness to be had in a kitchen. They just probably saw this as something for girls and they were being forced to do it. But for somebody who leads a busy and active life, cooking is therapeutic, like golf. It's a release from it. And he was a somewhat creative cook as well. He would take a recipe and he would modify it. His way of cooking a steak, for instance, was memorable. He would throw the steak into the fire, onto the coals, directly onto the coals, right towards the end of cooking, to give it a little extra flavor. Right? Nevertheless, people obviously say, God, wasn't that a great steak we had out at Ike's? There's now an Eisenhower cookbook.
Yeah.
If the caller is interested, there is an Eisenhower cookbook.
Right.
He better cook than Mamie?
Actually, the first letter, the earliest letter we have in his writing is in 1905. As a 15-year-old, when he and his brothers are sort of quarantined in the home because they're ill. And what are they doing? They're baking pies. You know, I didn't have any daughters. I mean, these boys knew how to cook.
We are live from Abilene, Kansas. This is the Eisenhower Center. This houses the house where Eisenhower grew up. It also houses the place of meditation where he is buried along with Mamie, his first son. We are bringing you the Stop 33 on our American President series, talking about the 34th President of the United States. And we have had 4 trains, Mr. Holt, come through here since we started. So it is true that the railroad industry is alive and living in Abilene.
Both main line on 2 tracks.
A lot coming up ahead on our program, but first we're going to move on and talk to you, show you a little bit about a 1955 news conference which was held by President in the Eisenhower. We'll be back to talk about the President's relationship with the media and his use of television.
That's a rather broad question, but I wondered if you'd care to say how you like the game of politics after 3 years.
Well, Mr. Aerosmith, the term politics as such seems to be one of those words that means many things to many people. We so often use it in the derogatory sense, and I think in the general derogatory sense, you can say, of course, that I do not like politics. Now, on the other hand, any man who finds himself in a position of authority where he has a very great influence in the efforts of people to work toward a peaceful world, toward international relationships that will eliminate or minimize the chances of war, all that sort of thing. Of course, it's a fascinating business. It's the kind of thing that would engage the intense interest of any man alive. There are, in this office, thousands of unique opportunities to meet especially interesting people, because the government here in Washington has become the center of so many things that, again, you have a very fascinating experience in meeting scientists, people, leaders in culture and health, in governmental action, and from all over the world. There are many things about the office and the work with your associates that are, well, let's say at least intriguing, even if at times they are very fatiguing. But they are, it's a wonderful experience. But the word politics, as you use it, I think the answer to that one would be no, I have no great liking for that.
I for president, I for president, I for president, I for president. You like Ike, I like Ike, everybody likes Ike for president. Hang out the banner and beat the drum, we'll take Ike to Washington. You like Ike, I like Ike, everybody likes Ike for president. Hang out the banner and beat the drum, we'll take Ike to Washington. We don't want John or Dean or Harry, let's do that big job right. Let's get in step with the guy that's hep, get in step with I. You like Ike, I like Ike, everybody likes Ike for president. Hang out the banner and beat the drum, we'll take Ike to Washington. I for president, I for president, I for president, I for president. You like Ike, I like Ike, everybody likes Ike for president. Hang out the banner and beat the drum, we'll take Ike to Washington. You like Ike, I like Ike, everybody likes Ike for president. Hang out the banner and beat the drum, we'll take Ike to Washington. We don't want John or Dean or Harry, let's do that big job right. Let's get in step with the guy that's hep, get in step with I. You like Ike, I like Ike, everybody likes Ike for president. Hang out the banner and beat the drum, we'll take Ike to Washington. We get where we are going, travel day and night for president. Let Adelaide go the other way, we'll all go with I. You like Ike, I like Ike, everybody likes Ike for president. Hang out the banner and beat the drum, we'll take Ike to Washington. Ike for president, Ike for president, Ike for president, Ike for president. You like Ike, I like Ike, everybody likes Ike.
That's the statue of Eisenhower in the middle of the Eisenhower Center. We're live in Abilene, Kansas today, talking about the 34th president. And we're listening to music from the 1952 campaign. We're joined on our set today by Dan Holt and Jeffrey Perret, two people who have worked with the Eisenhower and written about Eisenhower for many years. Mr. Holt, listening to that music, I guess my question to you is, what role did Walt Disney and Irving Berlin play?
Well, Berlin wrote the lyric, if you want to call it a lyric, and Disney did the animation.
Mr. Perret, how important was something like that in the 52 election?
Well, it made it more interesting. I
Had it been done before?
There'd been campaign songs before. See, I mean, who can not think of Happy Days Are Here Again without thinking of Franklin D. Roosevelt? A good campaign song is a big plus.
How big was this
We haven't
one?
had a good campaign song in a long time.
How big was this one? Did everybody know it?
Well, everybody already knew it before Eisenhower ran for, before Eisenhower's campaign really got rolling.
We're going to continue taking your calls, invite you to join us, and show you some pictures of this area. Again, live, Abilene, Kansas. Population, Mr. Holt?
About 6,800.
And population when Eisenhower lived here?
About 4,500.
Thank you very much. And let's talk a little bit about the period in which, after 1952, he's President of the United States. What's the first big thing he does, Mr. Perret?
He ends the Korean War.
How important was that to him?
Well, he wasn't going to be able to accomplish very much if he couldn't do that. That was really what he was elected to do. And Eisenhower understood, as well as any man in history, that the first business of the state is national security. He also found war to be just about the greatest of human failures. But many a career soldier has arrived at that point without being able to do much about it. When Eisenhower was inaugurated, he had an interminable inaugural parade, and right at the end of it, a 280 millimeter atomic cannon, the first atomic cannon, rolled unsteadily past the reviewing stand. Now, this wasn't the kind of thing you would expect to see in an inaugural parade, but it was there for a reason. Eisenhower had been to Korea, as he promised he would do, and people found that reassuring. They didn't expect a miracle, but his going to Korea, he didn't really learn very much from it. He didn't expect to learn very much from it, but it's a kind of a promise that he is going to make ending the Korean War the first order of business in his administration. And that's exactly what he does. Eisenhower said, we cannot go on fighting a war for small hills, which is what the Korean War had turned into. And he was lucky. People would sometimes comment on how lucky Eisenhower was. Stalin died in March 1953, 2 months after Eisenhower became president, and a new leadership came to power in the Soviet Union. They wanted to show that they were different from Stalin. And one way they could do that was to seek to negotiate with the United States rather than confront it. At the same time, there's the problem with the Chinese. The Chinese have a large army in Korea. How do you get the Chinese out? And Eisenhower extended a hand to the Russians. So I am new in this job, you are new in your jobs. This is an opportunity to put American-Soviet relations on a new basis, on a less confrontational basis. And he indicated his willingness to do that to this new leadership. At the same time, he was developing tactical atomic weapons, in effect to send a message to the Chinese. Eisenhower was not going to drop atomic bombs on Chinese cities, but he was telling the Chinese, if you continue to fight in Korea, you are going to face tactical nuclear weapons. We are not going to keep expending manpower on in these battles for small hills. And so he brings the war to an end, not by using the carrot, not by using the stick, but by holding up both the carrot and the stick. And in May of 1950, in June of 1953, the negotiations began at Panmunjom that led to a fairly rapid conclusion of the Korean War.
In terms of our negotiations with the Russians over the years, is it true that he somewhat used his post-war popularity and his image as somewhat of a benign leader to kind of allow the Russians to go first in the missile program, allow them to lead the way, so that indeed he could then find out more about what they had and what they could do with it, and that also then the Russians had to kind of take the fall for how worldwide public opinion would feel about all these missiles being over there. Is that fair to say or not?
Well, certainly he was benign. I don't think there was any wickedness in Eisenhower.
But did he know his popularity and know his image well enough to be able to use it with the Russians like that? Well,
I don't know that he was that popular in Russia, and it wouldn't have mattered anyway. There was no real public opinion in communist countries. Those countries are ruled by a small oligarchic elite, just hanging on to power without any democratic mandate. Eisenhower used his popularity at home in order to get a sometimes reluctant Republican Party, not the Democrats, but to get a sometimes reluctant Republican Party to agree to his international programs. And he used it very effectively there to get a Democratic Congress to support his legislation. So he saw his popularity as a tremendous political resource as long as he didn't go to the well too often.
What was at his highest point, his highest percentage popularity point in this country? What was it during his presidency? Do you know the percentage, Mr. Holt?
I don't recall. They didn't do the percentages like they do now.
Somewhere I read.
There was like a 70% rating in the period.
He got on a couple of polls. He got close to 80%.
Yeah.
And his rating never really fell below 70.
Mr. Holt, did he like the media? Did he like
Yeah,
reporters?
likes probably maybe too strong a word. I think he understood the media, and you have to remember that it's Eisenhower that really allowed TV to really become a major force in news reporting in the country. You know, he insisted that if the print media was going to be in the press conferences, television was going to be in the press conferences. I think he had people around him who understood, you know, really how to use this. The television side particularly is really very important. He's the first televised president. I don't think he enjoyed it that much.
Was he comfortable in front of the camera, Mr. Prey?
No, he was very uncomfortable in front of the camera. He couldn't stand to see a camera. Eisenhower would often, when he was giving a talk, say, from the Oval Office, he was sitting at his desk, and what he was looking at was a black blanket that had two small holes cut in it for the TV and camera lenses. Yeah. He couldn't stand it. And he was not very comfortable with journalists, because journalists were trying to get information out of him, and he knew so many secrets. He was terrified that if he relaxed for a moment, he might give away something that would jeopardize national security. So Eisenhower was always on his guard with journalists. However, he had a press secretary, Jim Haggerty. Right. Well, Jim Haggerty didn't have blood the rest of us, as the rest of us had. Jim Haggerty had printer's ink in his veins. He was a former New York Times journalist, and his dad had been a journalist. And Haggerty was comfortable with journalists. He liked them. They knew him. They trusted him. So, in effect, he'd handed over this part of the public relations job to an expert.
Next is Bowling Green, Indiana. Hello.
Good morning. This is Roy Turner. I'm retired from the U.S. Army, and in 1952 I was in the 714th Tank Battalion, in the 82nd Airborne Division, and I was in Eisenhower's inaugural parade, and I still see Mamie Eisenhower, when we passed the reviewing stand, she jumped up and clapped her hands, and that has burned in my memory and will always be there, and I share that with my grandchildren, and I think you all's program is great.
Thanks very much. We're going to talk more specifically about Mamie Eisenhower in just a few moments. When did they meet, Dan Holt?
At Fort Sam Houston. Mamie, the Dowd family, by that point in time, were well enough off that they could afford to winter in San Antonio. And if you're a young girl in San Antonio, where do you go to find a young man? You go to the military post, and she found one. He was a brand new second lieutenant, already had a quote-unquote love interest with some other ladies and one in Abilene, but it was almost an immediate match. I think the letter he writes back home concerning it, the girl he's running around now is called Miss Dowd. She's pretty much for the social side, which he didn't care that much for, but they get along very well, and he's seeing her every minute he can during that day.
That was a picture from their 50th wedding anniversary. When they were married, she was 19, he was 25. Where did they get married?
At her home in Denver.
Did she like military life?
Mamie was a great Army wife. That was her career, and I don't think there are many Army wives who did it any better than Mamie.
We're going to talk next to a student who is at Eisenhower High School in Houston, Texas. If you've been watching our presidential series, you know that one of the things we do this series for is for teachers to be able to use it in their classrooms across the country. And we, of course, want to talk to a student who is at a school named for the president we're at. We went to Houston, Texas, Eisenhower High School. His name is DJ Walter. Hello, Mr. Walter.
Good morning.
Tell me a little bit about Eisenhower and what his impact is and why there's an Eisenhower High School in Houston.
Okay. In my district, which is the Aldine district, we have 4 high schools. The first one was Aldine High School, which is because the town was Aldine. After that, the board had some kind of affiliation that they liked World War II and decided to name the first school, which was MacArthur, after General MacArthur. And then the second school came up, and they went with the fact that each had affiliation with Texas. And so Eisenhower came up because, of course, he was born in Texas. And then our school after that was Admiral Nimitz. And so Eisenhower, which is the best school in the district, but you didn't hear me say that, was named after that, which was 3 years after the passing of Dwight D. Eisenhower in '72.
Have you ever met an Eisenhower?
Excuse me, ma'am?
Have you ever met an Eisenhower, a member of the family?
Yes, I did. His granddaughter, Susan Eisenhower, I had the privilege to listen to her speak on U.S.-Soviet relations about a month ago. It was a real pleasure, and I actually got to talk to her personally. And she was greatly inspired by her grandfather, which was just nice to listen to her speak.
When you study about Eisenhower, which do you study most, the general or the president?
I think we studied the general most, as Eisenhower with pride, that he was a great war general, war hero. A lot of things of his presidency I really didn't know until I actually started looking into his research, as I'd done many projects on him over the past year. And in Texas, we learn of American history 8th grade year and 9th grade year, and I'm a senior this year. So I had to do studies on my own, basically, to know more about his presidency. But as far as his being a general, I think we know just about everything. Okay, let me not say that. We know a lot.
Thanks very much. DJ Walter is at Eisenhower High School in Houston, Texas, joining us as our student call-in this morning for Eisenhower. And we would tell the rest of our viewers also, or teachers who are out there, that we have a special program set up. It's C-SPAN in the classroom. And specifically what we want to do is to invite you to call us. We'll send you information. We'll send you classroom information. You can go to cspan.org/classroom or call us at 202-626-4858, and we'll get you materials that can help you teach about the presidents in your classroom, and all of our other programs on C-SPAN also. Again, 202-626-4858 if you'd like to do that. Lamar, Missouri, you're next.
Good morning.
Good morning.
What a privilege it is to call you from Lamar, Missouri, which is Harry Truman's birthplace.
How far are you from Abilene?
I beg your pardon?
How far are you from Abilene?
Well, that's probably 150, 180 miles. I think it's a little bit ironic that I've had the privilege of meeting both of these presidents face-to-face by living in Independence, Missouri, and being born here next to Lamar, Missouri. And I kind of wanted to, I admire both of those men. I voted for both of them on both tickets. And so anyway, I wanted to mention the fact that both of these presidents had a lot to do, I think, with the World War II veterans. When you stop and think that one won the war and the other one fought it, more or less, in a roundabout way of speaking. But why did both of these states, they both wanted to give World War II veterans a bonus when the war ended, and Harry Truman turned it over to the states. I have a letter, personal letter from him in his own handwriting saying that he regretted that, because here we have half of the states have paid that bonus. I think Kansas and Missouri should hold their head pretty low when they think that neither one of them have paid that bonus. They've had the opportunity now for 50-some years. Anyway, I'm not greedy. I don't want the money. I would just like to have the recognition that those two great men should be honored by following their wishes, perhaps. And I'll let you gentlemen comment on this. I've said enough, perhaps.
Thanks very much. Mr. Prey, any reaction?
There was a feeling in Washington during World War II that the bonus was not the best way to reward people who had served their country, and that the GI Bill was supposed to provide that. Now, if the states wanted to add something of their own to it, that was entirely up to the states. As your caller has indicated, some states have chosen not to do that for whatever reason. I don't think that Eisenhower, as president, was going to tell the state of Kansas what to do. And I don't think that Truman, as president, was going to tell the state of Missouri what to do. They had enough trouble dealing with Congress.
Mr. Holt, it is just after D-Day, and General Eisenhower has written a note, which you here call the note of failure. What is it, and what did he say?
Well, actually, it was written that evening.
The evening of D-Day.
The evening when he finally, after he gave the orders to go, he sits down and handwrites what we call the in case of failure note. Now, it was either intended to be broadcast if we failed on the beaches or printed. We're not certain, but it's a remarkable document in the effect that he assumes total responsibility for the failure of the invasion. The other remarkable side of it is he disposes of it once we're off the beaches. He no longer saw a need to keep the note because we had succeeded, and his naval aide, Commander Harry Butcher, said this should be part of your official diary, sir, and the note was saved. He was very tired, confused, and he comments about this later. One of his books, he actually dates it July 5th, 44.
I was going to say, at the bottom of that, it says July 5th.
June 5th. The man was physically worn out at that point, and the stress, and I think the confusion of it, he just, and he admitted this because some people have asked, well, did he expect to wait till July 5th, you know, to give the note that we'd failed, and that was not his answer to it. But it's one of the most interesting documents here, and I really like it. It's one of the best examples of Eisenhower we have, I think, of the man here, because once we were successful, nobody needed to know that he was going to accept total responsibility for the failure.
Klamath Falls, Oregon, hello.
Hello. I have some questions for both gentlemen. There seem to be only brief accounts about General Eisenhower's wise invitation to members of the press to witness the unspeakable horrors discovered in a liberated Nazi concentration camp. Is there any extant record of just who accepted his invitation? Were certain American officers from other theaters of war, the Pacific and Washington, also attending, and were they ordered to attend? Were certain American congressmen and senators present to bear witness? If so, who were those people?
Thanks, Oregon. Mr. Perret?
The conditions in those camps were so pestilential that they had to be cleaned up very quickly. The people Eisenhower took to those camps were essentially war correspondents attached to Allied units. He knew that it wouldn't take very long before people started denying that such camps had ever existed. So he wanted individuals of unimpeachable integrity to be able to stand up 20, 30 years later and say, I was there, I saw that. This really did happen. But there was very little time to do it. So there was no opportunity to say, bring people from the Pacific, or really people from very far away. But there were enough. Most of them were, as I say, war correspondents and other army officers whose collective testimony, I think, is enough to establish that the conditions in those camps were horrific beyond description. We couldn't even begin to describe them.
Go ahead.
One further note on that, he also actually ordered, or forced the Gauleiters, or the local governments, to go through those. And General Marshall actually questions him on why he did this, and Eisenhower replied in a letter stating basically that so in 50 years somebody could not claim this never happened, and that is on the entrance to the Holocaust Museum in Washington, D.C., the quote from that letter.
Springfield, Massachusetts.
Good morning. I'd like your guest's view on my impressions of Eisenhower. I followed the 1952 Republican Convention, and I was eligible to vote for the first time for Dwight Eisenhower's second term in 1956. My favorite Republican candidate was Robert Taft, but Ike defeated Taft. Ike was probably more electable, but since my family disliked Roosevelt
and his New Deal, and since Taft was the loyal opposition to Roosevelt, we favored Taft. Now, plus the fact that Ike was a Johnny-come-lately to the Republican Party. But anyway, Eisenhower went on to be a fine president. Eisenhower was a people person, and according to my father, he was a sheer genius in balancing the egos of the French and the English generals and political leaders. I don't think he was of the intellectual ability of Douglas MacArthur, but Ike was certainly less controversial, and he was a great president. And
Mr. Prey? Thank you, caller. Mr. Prey?
Well, this is an interesting question. And having written a MacArthur biography, I have addressed this question on a number of occasions. And I believe that Eisenhower was smarter than MacArthur. He wasn't as glib as MacArthur. But when MacArthur had a problem to solve that MacArthur couldn't solve, he handed it over to Eisenhower. And he wanted to keep Eisenhower with him. It wasn't that Eisenhower wanted to stay with MacArthur. Eisenhower was expected to perform a miracle in the Philippines in the 1930s because MacArthur had come up with a completely crazy plan, a plan that could never work, the kind of plan that a truly smart man would never have attempted to implement. And when MacArthur found that he couldn't do it, the person he turned to do it was Eisenhower. MacArthur rated Eisenhower's brains very highly.
When did Eisenhower first meet Kay Summersby?
In 42, when he goes to London initially to just begin the organization of an Allied structure and to look at the forces we had there. According to some information, the first time that he really met her, he and General Mark Clark through London. She was not really his driver, which is a misconception. Mickey McKeough really was Ike's driver, but they did have that first encounter. I don't remember if it was the April trip or it was the one when he went back in June in 42.
How does the museum deal with their relationship?
Well, we have her photographs up and with the other staff, and of course what we do if people ask us about the situation, we say we've got all these wonderful documents in the library that you can go over and research for yourselves and come to your own conclusions.
Mr. Perret, what conclusion did you come up with when you were researching your book?
Kay Summersby was a liar. I can document that.
A liar?
Oh, yeah. Her account is completely unreliable. It is the fantasy of a woman whose life was essentially a story of missed opportunities. She was close to Eisenhower, but nowhere near as close as she claimed in her second book. I think her first book presents a much more accurate picture. And she noticed a lot of things around Eisenhower's headquarters that most men would take for granted. And it is our good fortune that she wrote them down and left a record on a lot of really important points. So in some ways we owe Kay Summersby a lot. But her contention that she and Eisenhower had some kind of a romance or an affair is pure fiction. And I won't go into the details of this now, but she tells a number of stories that are demonstrably untrue. And as a result, her credibility, I think, is very low. She was an emotional prop at a time when Eisenhower needed that kind of emotional prop. But that's really all she was.
We asked Ike's son, John S.D., about his father's relationship with Kay Summersby. This is what he told us.
Well, the only problem I have is how idiotic people could be. That relationship was like a Mary Tyler Moore and Lou Grant relationship. Everybody was fond of Kay, including Dad. I was fond of Kay. She was a favorite around the office for anything, and he did. He did like to have her around, no question about it. but she never lived in his house. He had a house full of aides. There's absolutely no possibility of anything physical whatsoever, or really anything more than affectionate relationship. Now, that's just all there was to it. Now, when people say it's established that they had an affair, well, that person is just a plain liar. Or stupid.
Picayune, Mississippi, you're next. Go ahead, Mississippi. Sorry, we lost Mississippi. Let's go to Lexington, Kentucky.
Yes, hi. From a leadership standpoint, what can today's business executives learn from Eisenhower, and is there a book, a paper, or other resource on this subject?
Mr. Hull, business leaders learning from Ike.
Well, I think and this is my particular interest, and Jeff may want to talk about the later years, but Eisenhower's an amazing man organizationally, even in the 1930s. The work he did in the War Department, and they were sending him out on studies to do things that he absolutely knew nothing about. But there was something in preparation here, organization, structured organization. Yeah, I think businesses could learn a lot from that. You know, he's the first president who had a flow chart in the White House, for instance. So everybody knew where they were at and what the command structure was. And this is good business. I don't know of any publications looking at Ike the businessman, but an interesting side of this, several major corporations and other people tried to lure him away from the Army, even in the 1930s, go to work for them, which says a lot for his ability to organize and direct it. Now, economically, how sound he would have been, I don't know.
Mr. Perret, in the 1953, Eisenhower ordered the CIA to topple the premier in Iran, who was democratically elected. 1954, I think he did the same in Guatemala. Is that correct? And why did he do that?
I don't know that Eisenhower ordered the CIA to topple the premier of Iran, Dr. Mossadegh. The British already had a coup in the works and invited the CIA to be part of that coup. And what the United States provided mostly was money to pay people to go out in the streets of Tehran and demonstrate. The politics of Iran then, as now, was essentially fought out in the streets. And there were anti-Shah factions, there were pro-Shah factions, and that's where these battles were being fought. The premier of Iran, Mossadegh, was threatening to nationalize the British oil fields, British-owned oil fields in Iran. And therefore the British wanted him out and the Shah to be brought back from his exile in Paris.
What about Guatemala a year later?
Guatemala is a different case. There, Eisenhower really was in favor of an American-inspired coup d'etat against the democratically elected president of Guatemala, Jacobo Guzman. And at that time, Guzman was not a communist, but he had communist in his government and communist advisors. However, Guzman, Arbenz was really trying to implement land reform in Guatemala and to other countries round about, particularly Nicaragua. Land reform was as much of a threat as communism because Nicaragua was controlled by the Somoza family, who, as we know, were essentially thugs. And the idea of land reform, giving ordinary Guatemalans rights, was pretty explosive. Suppose it spread to Nicaragua and Panama. Well, Eisenhower felt that American national security interests warranted an intervention. And in doing that, he threw out the well-established non-intervention or good neighbor policy that Franklin Roosevelt had implemented 20 years earlier. Because before Roosevelt, from the Spanish Civil War until the Spanish-American War until the New Deal, the United States was constantly intervening in Latin America. And it seemed to solve nothing. And it certainly wasn't consistent with America's highest goals and ideals. And Eisenhower mistakenly threw out a perfectly good policy. It wasn't a question of supporting our bands or being indifferent to communism, but a coup in Guatemala was not really the right solution to the problem. Guatemala has been plunged into turmoil and civil war over the last 40 years. The people there have suffered terribly from the lack of a coherent political structure. Guatemala now has a democratically elected government, but overthrowing our bands, I think, was a terrible mistake.
Denver, you're next. Hello.
Yes, I've heard the rumor that German POWs were allowed to deliberately starve to death in American-controlled camps. Have you ever heard the rumor? Is there any truth to it? Was Eisenhower in any way complicit?
Thanks, Denver. Third time that's come up this morning already. Is that a story that people ask when they come in here?
Well, actually, no, not anymore. Ever since, particularly when the author was exposed for what he was, that book, and Steve Ambrose wrote a reply to it, and as we've discussed earlier this morning, it's a matter of interpretation. Actually, we looked at the research records. The man spent about an hour in the library doing his research, which isn't lends yourself to very in-depth study, and how the decimal points and the commas were moved in the numbers, and not understanding what other losses meant, as we discussed earlier. But no, I'm sort of interested this morning we've had that many calls, because we haven't had anybody ask us about this now in a year and a half or more.
1959, Alaska and Hawaii come in as states. Was that important to Eisenhower?
It was important to him in that he wanted to do it and he didn't want to do it.
Why didn't he want to do it?
Well, he thought it was all right for Hawaii to become a state, but he couldn't see that Alaska would ever be financially viable. So he wanted Hawaii to be a state. That made sense, even though Hawaii was probably going to send more Democrats to Congress than Republicans. He didn't want Alaska, but he had to take Alaska. And he bit the bullet. It wasn't that easy for him. He thought that Alaska was essentially a military base, and it should remain more or less as a military base, but not a military base that had 2 senators and a congressman.
Marshall, Virginia, you're next.
Hello, C-SPAN, and thank God for C-SPAN. Thank God I got through to you. A few points you mentioned back when Eisenhower was running for the presidency that hasn't been brought up, so that I thought might be of interest. You know, he also established a fashion trend for a while. He apparently, as a general, was responsible for the short jacket that officers primarily wore, which became known as the the Eisenhower jacket. Became a fashion trend among women in that period when they started wearing, the fashion started coming out with these short over jackets, and it remained for about 2 or 3 years.
Do you remember them?
As a young boy, I remember seeing my mother had one in her closet, I know, for a number of years, and I asked her one day about it, and she told me the story about it.
Mr. Holt, what was the background of that jacket? Why did Eisenhower design it?
It's based on primarily the British Army's short coat, which he thought still gave you some warmth and a dressy look, but you had easy access to your pockets, and just a very convenient type of jacket. It's amazing, early in his career, and when he's at Fort Lewis, Washington in 40, he's given an assignment to look at the new Army field jacket, and he makes all kinds of recommendations on that piece of uniform. I don't know whether he had a bent in his background to be a clothing designer or not, but it's a very convenient jacket. Now, the enlisted man's version is a little bit different than the officers. Matter of fact, my first Army issue was an Ike jacket.
Mine too.
Lots of Ike jackets out there.
Oh yeah.
How did it? When did it
I
flip
wish
over
I'd kept
to
mine.
when did it flip over to women and getting into the fashion of the Ike jacket too? Was that simultaneous?
No, that came, as the caller said, after the war. My first uniform was a brown uniform with an Ike jacket, and I thought it made me look a lot more like a soldier than the green uniform that replaced it, which looked like, to me, like a suit. And I think that was the idea. It was a way of recruiting people by giving them something that looked more fashionable. But
what was it? I'm sorry.
But the Ike jacket had a history, to my mind. Growing up in the 50s, that's how a soldier should look.
Yeah, and it was convenient if you did wear a belt or anything, you didn't have the long jacket under it. And it was
I just thought I looked good.
Yeah, they really were.
His stature. How tall was he?
Well, he's 5'11", basically, and very upright.
What did he weigh?
Looked like a general. Well, what time period?
That's true. About 180 pounds.
Yeah, about 180 on the average, and very athletic looking. Really.
Even after his leg injury, kept up his other sports with the golf and things like that to keep it.
Yes, he also had a weighted shoe on his left foot. He had a shoe that had a lead sole in it, and he used to sit in the Oval Office or exercising that left leg so that bum knee didn't lock up on it.
As we said earlier, he and Mamie got married. Mamie was 19. He was 25. We are live at the Eisenhower Center. And the Eisenhower Museum is part of the Eisenhower Center here in Abilene. And inside, what we're going to take a look at next is a little bit of the background of Mamie Eisenhower. They were married in 1916.
July the 1st.
You said she was a great Army wife.
Oh, yeah.
She achieved what I think is the ultimate among Army wives. The other Army wives liked her.
That's right.
And there's so much hierarchy among the wives. The wives more or less have the same rank as their husband. That creates a lot. That can create a lot of friction. But the other Army wives liked Mamie.
Dennis Medina is joining us over in the Mamie section. What can you show us first, Mr. Medina?
Hi, Connie. Yeah, we're going to talk about Mrs. Eisenhower's wedding. You mentioned July the 1st, 1916. We do have her wedding dress on exhibit. Originally, it was given to the Smithsonian in Washington and then given to the museum in the late 60s. It's been on exhibit ever since, and we accepted it that it would be on exhibit forever, which is not very practical because it's deteriorating. We have had it to a conservator and repaired, and we have light low levels on it. Also in that case that you're looking at right now with the wedding case, with the wedding dress, is a piece of the wedding cake, 1916. It looks real yummy.
That was an old.
How did you get the dress, and how did you get the cake? First of all,
Mrs. Eisenhower gave it to the museum. It was a piece that she had saved over the years.
A small wedding or big wedding?
It was a small wedding. It was in her parents' home in Denver. It was very quickly put together because they were going to get married in November, but because of the war, they pushed it up to July.
I want you to show us next her charm bracelet. What was the impact of Mamie Eisenhower's charm bracelet on what other women were wearing that day, those days? That
charm bracelet became very popular, and women started wearing them. Mamie's is, this one is gold. Most of them are 14 karat or 18 karat gold charms. They represent major milestones in her life. A little portrait of her when they were married, little White House is in there. Every star that Eisenhower earned, when he was awarded one, a new star was added to the bracelet. You mentioned in the lead to the program about John Sheldon Dowd. Someone called him David. He was named after his grandfather on his maternal side.
Fort Knox, Kentucky, you're next. Hello.
Hello, I'm here. Hello.
You're on the air, sir. Go ahead.
Hello. This is Mr. Curtis J. Cundiff, a Command Sergeant Major retired at Radcliffe, Kentucky, just south of Fort Knox. I'm delighted to get through to this subject, and I'm also delighted to talk to C-SPAN for the first time. I have a little bit of history here connected with John Eisenhower's son. I served in the Philippines during World War II, and not under the general, and I admire him greatly. However, at Fort Knox on 8th of March 1948, I was assigned here, and my son was born in the old brick hospital at Fort Knox on that date, along with David Eisenhower, which was born either 2 hours or 1 hour or before or after my son was born. And I've seen the Major John Eisenhower here at Fort Knox. He's assigned, I believe, to the Armored School because I used to attend a lot of my duty there was to attend a lot of the firepower demonstrations, and Major Eisenhower was one of the instructors out at the firing site there. I just wanted to say that this is part of the history of which I have in my 30 years of service, and I'm a retired Command Sergeant Major living here happily at Fort Knox near the Patton Museum. And not to take anything away from General Eisenhower, but it's been a great morning, a great program that you have, And someday I hope to come there to the museum where you're sitting there today. Thanks you so very much.
Thanks very much. Mr. Medina, what was Mamie's relationship with her son?
Oh, she was very close to him. In fact, when he got married, John lived at Gettysburg later on with him. And so they were very, very close. And, of course, she adored her grandchildren, and she had 4 of those.
We have some pictures of them right there, 3 of them exactly, on the screen right now. What was Mamie's influence on the style of the time? And I guess we'll start first with her hair, her haircut.
This is Elizabeth Arden. Elizabeth Arden saw Mamie in a photograph after a European trip and didn't think that her hair looked very well. And so she wrote Mrs. Eisenhower and told her that to come to her New York salon, and they would design a hairstyle and show any hairstylist how to cut, set in pin curls and comb it out, so that wherever she traveled it always would look the same. And I got the nickname the Mamie look.
Okay, so what's the final word, gentlemen? Were Mamie's bangs stylish, or did the American public not like them? Do you know, Mr. Prey?
I think middle-aged women probably liked them a lot better than younger women.
We're looking at what Elizabeth Arden thought they should look like right there. What about some of her dresses and the way in which she perceived her role as First Lady, Mr. Medina?
Well, we inherited 8 closets worth of clothes, so it's a wonderful collection dating from the 40s to the 70s. She was a clothes horse. She loved to dress up. And many times during the White House, she would have to go to a breakfast meeting and then to a luncheon. And so she made her dresses sort of function so it looked like she changed clothes all the time by adding a new accessory. And, of course, the hats of the period. She always had a hat on.
Please, show us the hats. There they are. Tell us a little bit about her hats.
Well, those were all designed by top designers of the 50s. She always felt that a lady, to be a true lady, had to be dressed in white gloves or gloves at all and wear a hat.
Newton, New Jersey, rather. Go ahead. Go ahead, Newton.
Hello, it's Newton, New Jersey. Earl Williams, Sylvain talking. I'd just like to bring out something that happened in 1960, a beautiful tribute to our president. It was called Dinner with Ike. It was a nationwide closed-circuit TV program coordinated with several of the big cities, New York and Los Angeles. And the addresses were by the president, the vice president, Senator Morton, and Nelson Rockefeller. Now, the reason I know about this, I have in my possession a beautiful program that includes a photocopy of Eisenhower's painting of Lincoln and also a photocopy of Eisenhower's picture of a painting that was done by Alex Gardner. And it was just about 5 years before that. I was fortunate enough to have been on television with Nelson Eddy in the Desert Song, and that's precipitated many of the appearances that I did in banquets in Washington, D.C. But it was really a highlight to be on that tribute with Ike, because earlier on I was a veteran of World War II in the Navy. I would wonder if the gentlemen have ever seen or heard anything about that in their research.
Thanks. Mr. Prey? Mr. Holt, anything?
Well, I've heard about it. I'm not sure what the significance of that was for anyone who wasn't there.
A question about, he was talking about Ike's painting. We haven't even talked about his
paintings. Oh, well, Ike's paintings are significant.
Why did he paint?
Well, he'd seen Winston Churchill paint and thought it was a wonderful relaxation. For somebody under that kind of pressure, I think painting is probably a wonderful escape. He had physical activity in golf and in cooking. But to just be able to sit down and paint or draw, that develops a different part of yourself.
That was a portrait that he did of his son, and then also there's these landscapes. Mr. Holt, what all do you have here here in Abilene of what the former president did?
Well, it's an extensive collection, and we rotate it on exhibit, so they're not out all the time. But one thing about his painting I think is interesting, and Jeff mentioned Churchill. Eisenhower and Churchill corresponded right up until the time of Churchill's death. And they might be discussing world affairs and politics, but almost invariably, every letter contains a paragraph about their painting. So they both understood why they were doing it, and of course Eisenhower always said Churchill was much better artist than he was, and vice versa. But I think it's remarkable, these two gentlemen, world leaders, and they're writing, and then all at once you have a paragraph or two that's talking about their current artwork or work in progress.
Dennis Medina, what did Mamie think of the painting?
Well, she had quite a few of them in her collection. The museum has 28 currently. We're always seeking new ones. But she liked them so much that she chose 6 of them to be the covers of Christmas cards during the White House years. And 2 years they used, one was a photograph of the green room and another was portraits of the 2 of them that were used as official Christmas cards, and they were made by Hallmark Cards.
Dennis Medina is the museum curator here at the Eisenhower Center, and you and Mr. Perret have something in common, I understand. You both went to a lot of schools. So before we tell you goodbye, Mr. Medina, Mr. Perret, I hate to tell you this, but how many schools did you attend growing up?
62.
And how many did you attend, Mr. Perret?
I concede the trophy in that case. I went to a mere 23 before I graduated from high school.
And the reason you went to 23 schools?
Well, I grew up in a show business family, so I went to 23 schools in 3 countries.
Mr. Medina, how did you get to 60-some schools?
I'm an Air Force brat.
Ah, now we understand. Thank you very much for joining us this morning.
Eisenhower really loses out. He only lived in 27 different places. So
27? Is that true? 27 different places?
Yeah, I've lived in probably more than that. But how at 62? It's like every 2 months you must
That's
have
right.
gone.
Bath, Maine, you're next. Hello.
Amazing.
Go ahead, Maine.
He's doing a school week.
Hello?
You're on the air, sir. Go ahead.
Yes. Is it true that General Eisenhower ordered Operation Keel Haul at the end of World War II, in which allegedly 2 to 3 million people, displaced persons, and Russian prisoners of war forcibly were repatriated behind the Iron Curtain and were shot there by the Soviets?
Mr. Perret.
That was not a military decision. That was a political decision. We discussed this earlier in connection with the Yalta Accords. It was national policy that these people who, for whatever reason, managed to get away from the Soviet Union or Soviet or communist control were going to be repatriated. I think it was a tragedy. The only question that was often asked of these people by their NKVD interrogators is, why are you still alive? If you didn't give them a good enough answer, they shot you, or they sent you to the Gulag where you'd probably die. But that was not Eisenhower's decision. That was a decision that stemmed from national policy within the alliance. That decision was really made by politicians, which is where it should be made. So he was implementing what his government told him to do. And Eisenhower did have a boss. His boss was the combined chiefs of staff in Washington. And they set down the broad policy directives that it was for him to implement.
As an adult, Mr. Holt, did he have a best friend?
Milton.
After Milton?
Well, he had a number of friends. I think Milton was, if you have a best friend, in my opinion, Milton Eisenhower was probably
brother and
the true best friend he had.
There was nobody closer.
Nobody closer at all. That he could really sit down and relate to. The correspondence between the two men is wonderful, even going back into the 30s when Milton's with the Department of Agriculture and he's advising Ike, and Ike's going back. And I think one of the most remarkable letters is, and it's humorous. Eisenhower had a good sense of humor, and everybody sort of overlooks this, but Milton had been offered a deanship at Penn State University. And Eisenhower writes a 5 or 6 page letter going through all the implications of what a college dean should be, and he makes a remark that one thing would be securities, and they'd never fire a college dean. And he recommends that Milton take it. Milton turns it down, and of course then later he's president of Penn State University. But they had this total understanding of each other. When they said something, they knew exactly what the other person meant.
Mr. Holt and his colleagues edited these papers, which in this book on Eisenhower, which is still available. Let's go next to Albuquerque, New Mexico. Go ahead.
Good morning. This relates to the author's comments trying to fathom the personality of Eisenhower, and I would say he was real as relating to our family. My uncle was a personal cook for Eisenhower. James Martin, Sergeant James Martin, his relationship with some of the black officers and personnel in his staff related to them on a very personal level that continued to be ongoing throughout their later lives, as in forms of condolences, keeping up with the family, even to the extent of John Eisenhower still being very involved in some of the activities in and out of our family. And in addition, one of the anecdotes that was remembered quite fondly in our family was a story of my uncle cooking for Eisenhower, who he loved cinnamon rolls, and was a very simple man who would often show up in the Army kitchen early in the morning and assisted my uncle in cooking the morning meal.
Thanks, New Mexico. Appreciate that. 1954, the Brown versus Board of Education desegregation decision by the Supreme Court. What impact did that have on Eisenhower?
He thought the decision was right in principle, but wrong in implementation. He was a little confused at first as to how something that had been legal for 50 years could suddenly be wrong. But he wasn't a lawyer. However, he had already ordered the District of Columbia to have complete desegregation in all public places, in the movie theaters and so on, because Washington itself was a predominantly black town, but it was rigidly segregated. It was a southern town. And Eisenhower put an end to that very early in his presidency. And he took a close interest in the Brown decision. As I say, he felt the decision was right. But he was convinced that if it was implemented in the wrong way, it would lead to more segregation, not less. He wanted the federal courts to impose desegregation very rapidly on school districts, and believed that that phrase, with all deliberate speed, was a terrible mistake, because it would give communities, particularly in the South, enough time to empty the public schools of most of the white children and put them in private schools. The state legislatures would then find ways of financing those ostensibly private schools, leaving impoverished schools full of black children who were going to get an inferior education. So he did not believe that the way Brown was going to be implemented would do any good at all, that it would lead probably to a more segregated society.
Mr. Holt, how do you answer criticism, if it comes up here, that Eisenhower didn't do enough in desegregation in the following years after 54?
Well, again, basically our role here is to provide the information for him to do the research. But people overlook a couple of things. Number one, he instituted most of the desegregation of the armed forces. President Truman signed the bill and began it, but Eisenhower really had to carry most of that through, and the problems were very difficult. And it's interesting, Jeff used the analogy of going into the schools right away. One of the first things Eisenhower did in implementing that was to integrate all the ROTC units on land-grant colleges, which he had the power, the federal government had the power to do, because they could withhold their money. So there was things like that he saw that could be done very quickly. You have to remember, the first Civil Rights Act since Reconstruction was passed in 1957, and then of course we look at Little Rock. You know, whether he wanted to do this or not, it had to be done, and it was done. So yes, there's a lot of people who say that he was just reacting, which is possibly true. in a lot of situations. But there's some new appraisals coming out on this now because the work that was done. It's a difficult comparison. You have to look at the time period of the 50s and not look at it in today's context to determine, was this really active in doing this? Plus, the other concern he had was how does he protect the Brown v. Topeka Act on the Supreme Court? And we've had a program here recently where an attorney stroke historian has compared him to Abraham Lincoln, saying that in Abraham Lincoln's day, this was a radical revolutionary move for some of the things Lincoln did and said, or the Emancipation Proclamation, or the Dred Scott case. Lincoln had to appoint people to the Supreme Court to overturn Dred Scott. Eisenhower had to appoint people to the Supreme Court to make sure Brown v. Topeka was not overturned. So there's a lot of very complicated issues in this, but we mainly just try to provide the information for them.
If I could just add to what Dan has said, Eisenhower actually redrafted the brief in the second Brown decision. I've seen it with this, and he's trying to make the brief stronger. He's not trying to weaken it. Similarly with the
government's brief into
because there are two Brown decisions.
Right.
One is in fact on principle and the other on implementation. It comes a year later. And he wanted to make sure, I was trying to make sure that the court understood that he wanted effective and fairly rapid implementation and amended the government's brief accordingly. He was closely involved in this. He didn't stand back. He wasn't detached. And when the 1957 Civil Rights Act came to him, he nearly vetoed it because it wasn't strong enough. The things that he wanted in there to make it effective had more or less been removed just to get it through Congress, and he was appalled, but this was his bill. In the end, he signed it, but he didn't want it. He wanted a stronger bill. And the last point I want to make is this, that Eisenhower is the president who puts the power of the federal government behind the civil rights movement, behind the push for integration in a more just society. It doesn't come later. It really comes with him, and later administrations then follow through on it. But it's Eisenhower's the one who commits the federal government to the integration of American society.
Selma, Alabama, you're next. Hello.
That was Wade Zimmerman, World War II veteran, Confib Trapac, U.S. Pacific Fleet. The main thing I was calling in about, I was at the Fitzsimmons General Hospital when President Eisenhower was there, and I attended chapel with him. I was very fortunate it was a small chapel on the upper stories of the hospital, and he came in late with the Secret Service, and we turned around and I raised my hand, which was in a cast, as a salute to him, and he smiled, and it was such a warm smile.
This was while he was in the hospital there also?
Uh-huh. Yeah, he was there at the hospital in the wheelchair, and he had this big button on the front of his shirt there, and it says, "I'm fine." And I guess that so many people must have asked him how well he was, and he just had that button made up, and that saved him a lot of conversation, I guess.
Thanks, Alabama. Mr. Holt, what is it about that button? Or he had it engraved. He had it actually embroidered on his shirt.
Actually, it's embroidered
on
his pajama shirt.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
What
and
did
I think it actually just says, "I'm doing better."
Much better.
Much better. Thank you. Yeah. Yeah, and that's what it was.
When did he have his first heart attack?
Yeah.
When did he have his first heart attack?
Well, this is a point of conjecture too. There's some people now that feel he may have had some minor attacks by the end of World War II, over the time period from the stress and things. And this is basically was a moderate heart attack. I think it was a good wake-up call. You know, to start looking to take a little better care of himself.
Was he a smoker?
Yes, he was a smoker, although he wasn't smoking at that time. He'd given up smoking sometime before that.
Was he a drinker?
Not really. He'd have an occasional drink.
How many heart attacks did he have over the period?
Well, by my counting, 6. I don't believe he had a heart attack before 1955.
Next call, Powhatan, Virginia.
It's Powhatan. That's Pocahontas' father.
Sorry.
I'm calling in regards to the statehood papers signed by Eisenhower, and there's something that very, very few people know. he not only signed the statehood papers for Alaska and Hawaii, he also signed them for Ohio. In 1953, when Ohio was celebrating its sesquicentennial, somebody thought it would be a good idea to take out the statehood papers and make copies of them for souvenirs. And they got them out and discovered they had never been signed. And so Eisenhower signed them retroactive to 1803, which made all the Ohioans angry because we wanted to get our income tax back.
Thanks. Is this new information for you, gentlemen? Have you ever heard this story?
No, I hadn't heard this story before, but I'm glad I've heard it now.
Yeah, no, I hadn't heard that one.
The interstate highway system. How did he come up with the idea? Or was it his idea?
The interstate highway system was probably one of those ideas that had been kicking around among thoughtful and intelligent people for a long time. Now people say, well, it has something to do with Eisenhower and the great truck train at the end of World War I, where he was part of this truck convoy that went all across the U.S. And I'm sure that played a part. So did seeing the German autobahns at the end of World War II. But there are other things as well. There were people in Congress who were pushing for it. The Portland Cement Company was pushing for it. Eisenhower was the one, however, who saw an opportunity there and made sure that the legislation was gotten through Congress. At first it failed. The states were against it because of the way it was being financed. And Eisenhower then came up with a very clever idea to get the states involved. The federal government would put up 90% of the money, the states put up 10% of the money, and there was a 4-cent tax on a gallon of gasoline. So there was no addition to the national debt. And people accepted that. It's paying a little extra for gasoline today to have much better roads tomorrow. And it was an intelligent solution to a complex problem because there were so many political and special interests always involved in highways. Every county, every state, highways means money for somebody. And there can be fierce disputes over local highways or state highways. And Eisenhower found a way to cut through all of that and create an interstate highway system that he knew wouldn't be finished in his lifetime, but would be of benefit to the country for decades to come. He also had managed very cleverly to implement the biggest public works program in American history, and the Republicans didn't even notice.
Yeah. Right.
Butte, Montana.
I'm interested in the appointment of Earl Warren to the Supreme Court. I think it was a good appointment, but I understand that Eisenhower regretted it later. Could you explain why he did so?
Thanks. And besides Earl Warren, he also nominated, or also put on the bench, John Marshall Harlan and Charles Whitaker and William Brennan.
Yes, a Democrat.
Mm-hmm.
Earl Warren.
Earl Warren was an inspired choice, but not because Eisenhower was felt inspired at the time. It was really a political thank you to Earl Warren for helping Eisenhower get the nomination in 1952. When I say it's inspired in the light of history. Eisenhower did at one time say that putting Warren on the court was my biggest mistake, but Eisenhower actually had somewhat mixed views about Warren. What made Eisenhower mad about Warren was not the Brown decision. It was the communist cases, the laws that the Eisenhower administration got passed in 1954 to curb communists. And the law, and he felt the court was, in effect, being too liberal in its interpretation of these laws and undermining his attempt to get communists out of government and to reduce the power of communists to affect the political process. So that's why he was really mad at Warren. And as I say, he went through phases in his attitude toward Warren. So you can pick him at one phase where, in fact, he's very friendly towards him, or in another phase where, in fact, he's extremely critical. I think the main thing, though, is that Eisenhower created a truly great court, not only and the Supreme Court, but his federal appointments, the appointment of federal judges, was really good. I don't think any president has done a better job. And you'll find in the 1960s the judges who are in effect forcing these reluctant Southern communities to accept the Warren Commission's the Warren Court's decisions. They're Eisenhower's appointees. The standard of Eisenhower's judges is very, very high.
Here's the book Jeffrey Perret has coming out, just arriving in bookstores this week. So if you say, gee, I haven't seen that, it's probably because you haven't seen it. It's just getting there. Sioux Falls, South Dakota. You're next. Hello. Oh, actually, we have Potomac, Maryland's next. Hello, Potomac.
Sioux Falls.
Go ahead, Sioux Falls.
I wanted to see if the gentleman would comment on President Eisenhower's relationship with George S. Patton, Jr., both as a protege of Patton's and later as his commander.
Did he like Patton, Mr. Holt?
Oh, I think early on, there's no question. Especially, they shared a great interest in tanks, and it's well known they would sit up and talk tank tactics and the use of tanks with infantry and all these things along. Of course, I'm not sure Patton ever really had a close personal friend beyond his. That's just my opinion. But yeah, they get along very well. And Patton was trying to find Eisenhower a command position with troops before World War II, and Eisenhower actually once thought he was going to get a tank command under George Patton. I think the relationship begins to disintegrate a little bit when Eisenhower and other officers passed Patton in rank. Some historians look at it as a major break in the relationship, but still a great amount of respect. The interesting thing about Eisenhower, he knew he needed Patton in World War II, and Eisenhower sometimes is criticized for not making the slapping incidents of the soldiers an official reprimand. But this is Eisenhower, the commander, looking at this. The reprimand letter is very severe that he writes to Patton, but I think he also anticipated down the road, I may need this man. And I think if Patton had done it again or gotten into more trouble, he'd probably been out, because Eisenhower would only go so far with his belief in his fellow officers and men. But
Jeffrey Perret, talk about Dwight David Eisenhower, the author.
Dwight David Eisenhower, the author, had one tremendous advantage. He could write very well. He did not need editors to rewrite his material. He didn't need ghostwriters. His best subject at West Point was English, and he's a good illustration of, I think you're just showing Waging Peace.
Mm-hmm,
well,
yes.
that was a committee job. I'm talking about when Eisenhower actually wrote a book himself, such as At Ease. He demonstrated and he dictated Crusade in Europe, and it's a very fine book. The volumes on his presidency, I think, are pretty dull and not very revealing. They managed to be thorough without really telling you very much. MacArthur was once asked, by a young officer, what should I do in order to advance in my career? And MacArthur's answer was, the best skill any soldier can have, if he wants to get ahead in his career, is the ability to write. Now, Grant's writing ability had a lot to do with Grant's rise in the Union Army. MacArthur's writing ability had a lot to do with MacArthur eventually becoming Chief of Staff, and Eisenhower's writing ability had a lot to do with his becoming Supreme Commander. If you can write a report that people will actually read and understand, if you can write orders that people will understand, if you can put something in front of the Chief of Staff, draw up a plan that makes sense, if you can do all of those things, your career is going to be comparatively straightforward. You're going to be promoted from one job to another. And it's that ability to write that really pays off throughout his career.
We are sitting live in an area of the museum in which there are some of the memorabilia around us. Mr. Holt, in back of me is the Cadillac.
yes, the staff car, the 42 Cadillac. Eisenhower used it throughout the war. He actually had it at NATO. He goes to NATO. It was actually held in reserve for him when he was at Columbia in case he needed to use the car. And then General Grunther headed NATO, and it was later surplus by General Services Administration, and a group of anonymous donors from Abilene and the area purchased the car at auction.
We'll continue looking at it as we take a call from Houston, Texas. Hello, Houston.
Good morning. I'd like to add a little information to this Ike jacket. My dad was a tailor in Columbus, Georgia. We had an apartment in the back of the tailor shop. At some point in the late 30s, Eisenhower was in Fort Benning, or at Fort Benning. At that time, the Army had a piece of uniform called a beaver coat. It was a three-quarter length coat that was designed primarily for the cavalry that had been discontinued. And Ike brought them in for my dad to modify as just a piece of clothing. And my dad designed that jacket for him. The original version had a double inverted pleat in the center, inverted pleats on the outside of the back, and the waistband fit down on the hips. When Eisenhower became general, as one of his prerogatives, he offered that as an introduction to the uniform. They modified it by raising the waistband to the waist, took out the double inverted pleat in the center. It went on to become what I understood in '55 when I went in the military as being one of the more popular, or most popular, pieces of uniform ever in the United States military. And even to the point where when it was discontinued, guys would keep one off base and wear it off base, even at the risk of getting Article 15 for it. So the jacket itself carries a history of its own.
Thanks very much for the call. Your reaction?
Well, when I went in the Army in 1958, we were given two uniforms. We were given a brown uniform with brown boots and a green uniform with black boots. And the brown boot, black boot army existed only for about a year, and at the end of that year, we were told to hand in the brown uniform and get a second green one. And what the caller said is absolutely true. Some people held on to the brown uniform, but particularly the Ike jacket, and I held on to mine until I got out of the Army, and then, unfortunately, I got rid of all of my uniforms. I suppose...
President Dwight Eisenhower. This program is about 2.5 hours.
Everybody likes Ike for president. Hang out the banner, beat the drum. We'll take Ike to Washington.
D. Dwight Eisenhower's odyssey to the White House began near the turn of the century. Although he was born in Denison, Texas in 1890, he and his 5 brothers were raised in the sober farming community of Abilene, Kansas. There, they were taught to appreciate hard work and to fear God. With his broad grin and affable personality, Eisenhower, or Ike as he was known, most closely resembled his mother, Ida. The Abilene High School class of 1909 voted Eisenhower best historian and mathematician. But his dream was to become a soldier. He abandoned his job at the local creamery in 1911 to enter West Point Academy, where he officially became known as Dwight D. Eisenhower. Ike met the vacationing Mamie Dowd at his first Army post in Fort Sam Houston, Texas. At an afternoon party, they sipped grape juice together. Immediately smitten, he proclaimed her saucy, and she told a friend that he was, quote, a bruiser. They were married on July 1st, 1916. While Eisenhower was on assignment in Georgia in 1917, Mamie gave birth to their first son, Dwight Dowd Eisenhower, or Icky. Goodbye for now, he wrote in a letter to Mamie following Icky's birth. I love you, love you, love you awful much. Icky died of scarlet fever 3 years later. Eisenhower called his...
President Dwight Eisenhower. This program is about 2.5 hours.
Everybody likes Ike for president. Hang out the banner, beat the drum. We'll take Ike to Washington.
D. Dwight Eisenhower's odyssey to the White House began near the turn of the century. Although he was born in Denison, Texas in 1890, he and his 5 brothers were raised in the sober farming community of Abilene, Kansas. There, they were taught to appreciate hard work and to fear God. With his broad grin and affable personality, Eisenhower,
or Ike as he was known, most closely resembled his mother, Ida. The Abilene High